London's finest drawing rooms always smelled faintly of roses, lavender, and something far sharper beneath the lace. Behind the silk screens and gilt mirrors, high society women drifted like pale ghosts, their waists cinched to impossible inches, their smiles held in place by quiet desperation. Thin was elegance, thin was purity, and thin, in the late Victorian age, was often purchased in powder form. A pinch of coca leaf tonic before supper, a sip of opium-laced cordial before bed. Doctors prescribed it, husbands approved of it, society applauded it. But behind the velvet curtains, the truth was colder. These slimming tonics hollowed their users from the inside out, stealing hunger, stealing sleep, and eventually stealing the very women who lived by them. Their glamour, their fragility, their fashionable faintness, all symptoms of a chemical dependence no one dared to name. Subscribe and stay with me. There are more shadows to follow, more parlors to enter, and more secrets high society prayed you would never hear. Tell me, where are you listening from tonight? The past was never as graceful as it pretended to be. The morning light slipped through the tall windows of Mayfair like a shy intruder, pale and uncertain, as if even the sun hesitated before disturbing the delicate rituals of London's high-born women. Inside those quiet rooms, where silk curtains softened every corner and perfume clung to the air like whispered promises, another ritual was beginning, one far older than the fashions that claimed it. A maid, hands steady from long practice, drew the corset's laces through polished eyelets, pulling until the garment creaked in protest. Her mistress stood perfectly still, her breath already shallow, her fingers gripping the carved vanity table as the waist beneath her gown shrank toward the coveted 18 inches. It was not merely a measurement, it was an expectation, a commandment, a subtle decree written across society pages and drawing room glances. A woman who could not be cinched that tightly was whispered about, not cruelly, but with that particular brand of Victorian pity reserved for those whose bodies refused to bow to fashion. And so, they tightened, they starved, they allowed the world to reshape them until the act of breathing itself became something delicate, almost ornamental. Lady Eleanor Whitcomb felt the familiar spin of faintness travel up her spine as the corset constricted. The room shimmered at the edges, the scent of lavender water grew sharper, nearly metallic, yet she smiled. A thin waist was a triumph, a badge of refinement. She had been raised to believe that hunger was unseemly, appetite unfeminine, and visible ribs a sign of enviable fragility. Her mother had told her so. Her governess had reinforced it. Society itself reminded her daily. But fragility, they did not mention, required assistance. Her gaze flicked toward the small glass vial resting near the silver hairbrush on her vanity. A delicate bottle containing a powder so fine it sparkled faintly in the morning sun. Coca leaf tonic recommended by physicians, praised in fashionable circles, available over any chemist's counter with no more ceremony than the purchase of soap. A pinch dissolved beneath the tongue soothed the nerves, steadied the pulse, and most desirably banished hunger as thoroughly as if it had never existed. She reached for it without hesitation. The powder melted like frost on her tongue, carrying with it a soft, rising brightness that spread through her chest in gentle waves. The dizziness eased. The pressure of the corset felt less like a crushing force and more like a reassuring embrace. Her heartbeat softened into a pleasing rhythm. She closed her eyes and allowed the room to settle, allowed her mind to drift toward the long day of appearances ahead, the charity luncheon where she would nibble at nothing, the dressmaker's appointment, the evening gathering where she would glide like a ghost through a haze of candlelight and polite conversation. Thinness was elegance, elegance was power, and in Victorian London, power often came in bottles labelled as restorative, invigorating, or recommended by leading physicians. Outside her door, the household moved quietly, servants whispering, carriages rattling in the street, the world preparing for the day. But inside her chamber, Lady Eleanor inhaled as deeply as her corset allowed, letting the sweetness of the tonic settle like silk through her veins. She did not think about the meals she would skip, or the trembling in her hands when the daylight faded, or the growing reliance she tried not to name. She simply admired her reflection, the narrow waist, the luminous eyes, the delicately hollowed cheeks, and believed, as so many women did, that this was beauty, this was refinement, this was the price of being seen. And in that soft, shimmering moment, with the tonic blooming beneath her ribs and the corset claiming its victory, she did not yet realize that she had begun a descent dressed as achievement, a slow unraveling hidden beneath lace, powder, and the quiet applause of a society enamored with frailty. The looking-glass in Mrs. Adelaide Harrow's dressing room had witnessed more confessions than any priest in London. It stood tall and solemn between two gas lamps, its surface slightly clouded by years of perfume, mist, hair powder, and whispered vanity. Each morning, Adelaide approached it the way a penitent approaches an altar, cautiously, reverently, with the quiet fear that the reflection staring back might reveal more than she wished the world to see. The hour was early, the sky still the colour of watered milk, and the house lay silent except for the delicate hum of servants preparing the day. Adelaide's chamber, with its pale blue wallpaper and faint scent of violet sachets, felt suspended in a soft, perfumed stillness. Upon the vanity, arranged with impeccable precision, lay ivory-handled brushes, gilded scent bottles, a folded lace handkerchief, and a small crystal box filled with fine white powder. It was the powder she reached for first. Coca leaf powder, a tonic recommended by society magazines, by fashionable physicians, by friends whose waists were narrower than Adelaide's, and whose eyes glittered with a peculiar sharpness beneath their veils. It steadies the hands, they said. It calms the nerves, it sharpens the mind, and my dear, you hardly feel hungry at all. The last promise was the one that lingered. Her fingers trembled slightly as she lifted the lid. The powder lay smooth as fresh snow, without scent, without warmth, without judgment. It was easier than maintaining grace, easier than declining pastries at teas or loosening her corset after supper. Easier than pretending she had not overheard Lady Pembroke whispering that Adelaide was handsome, yes, but perhaps a touch too sturdy around the middle. A touch too sturdy. The words had lodged themselves under Adelaide's skin like a splinter. She dipped the tip of a silver scoop into the powder and brought it to her lips. The particles dissolved instantly, leaving behind a cold, fleeting spark that warmed her thoughts, even as it numbed her body. Her heartbeat fluttered lightly, a bird testing its wings. Her breath felt longer, the room brighter. The oppressive sense of heaviness that had clung to her since waking evaporated as though someone had opened a window. She did not feel hungry, not in the least. She settled onto the velvet stool before her mirror and touched her fingertips to her cheeks. Already they seemed finer, more defined, shadows deepening beneath her cheekbones like an artist's touch. Her eyes looked larger, brighter. She imagined the society ladies admiring her newly sharpened profile, the men bowing with renewed interest, the quiet, poisonous whispers shifting in her favor. The powder had its price, the restless nights, the trembling limbs, the odd, hollow sensation that sometimes rose beneath her ribs. But Adelaide had learned what Victorian society taught all its daughters. Beauty excused all suffering. Thinness excused even more. A soft knock sounded at the door, her maid arriving with tea. Adelaide swept the crystal box into a drawer with practiced ease. The tonic was an open secret among her class, yet never openly named. It lingered in the background the way hunger did, silently, politely, constantly. "Shall I bring breakfast, ma'am?" the maid asked. "No," Adelaide replied, smoothing her hair. "Tea will be enough. Enough for the version of herself she was expected to be. Enough to keep her floating, weightless, through another day of luncheons she would not eat, conversations she would glide through, compliments she would pretend to believe. She rose, adjusting her corset, the powder singing quietly through her veins. As she stepped toward the door, the mirror caught her one last time, a slender figure framed in soft morning light, elegance carved at a cost she dared not calculate. And behind her reflection, half hidden on the vanity, the small powder box glimmered like a promise or a warning. Night came softly to Belgrave Square, sliding between the tall windows like a dark velvet ribbon. Gas lamps flickered in the fog outside, casting trembling halos across the pavements, while inside the great houses, servants moved quietly, drawing curtains and trimming wicks. In Mrs. Clara Ashbury's bedroom, the hush felt almost sacred, the kind of silence that belongs to confession or collapse. Clara sat on the edge of her bed, fingers grazing the embroidered coverlet, feeling the familiar thrum of restlessness beneath her skin. It had been building all day, during the charity tea, where she forced a smile through a fog of dizziness, during the dress fitting where every pin felt like a reprimand, during supper, where she moved food around her plate with a grace her stomach no longer supported. By the time she returned home, exhaustion clung to her shoulders like an unwelcome shawl. Yet she did not ring for the doctor. She did not cry out for assistance. She reached, instead, for the nightstand drawer. The drawer slid open with a soft sigh, revealing a small blue glass bottle nestled among lace gloves and neatly folded handkerchiefs. The bottle was hand-blown, smooth as river stone, labelled in gold script, Laudanum Cordial, a gentle remedy for women's ailments. The words glowed faintly in the lamplight, polished by years of handling, of trust, of need. Her fingers closed around it with practiced familiarity. Opium, dissolved in alcohol, the Victorian miracle, prescribed for everything from sleeplessness to melancholy, from cramps to female nervousness. But every woman Clara knew took it for the same unspoken reason. It softened the world. It muted hunger. It wrapped the mind in a warm, floating quiet where nothing sharp could reach. She uncorked the bottle. The scent rose sweet, resinous, with a dark undertone that reminded her of old churches and deeper sins. She tipped the cordial into a small silver spoon, watching the liquid glow like syrupy amber. Then she lifted it to her lips. The warmth spread instantly, first along her tongue, then down her throat, then blooming slowly beneath her collarbones. Her shoulders loosened, her breathing eased. The ache behind her eyes dissolved into a pleasant, humming nothingness. She leaned back against the pillow, the room tilting into soft, forgiving shapes. This was the hour she relied on most, the quiet descent into artificial stillness, the moment when the demands of the day untangled themselves and sank like stones to the bottom of her mind. The cordial stole her hunger, her sorrow, her sense of suffocation under society's gaze. It offered peace, of a sort, wrapped in velvet darkness. But peace came with its own shadows. Clara's maid had found her once sitting upright in bed, eyes glassy, breath shallow, the cordial bottle uncapped beside her. The maid had said nothing, only tucked her in and extinguished the lamp. Servants in grand houses knew better than to speak of their mistress's vices. Silence was part of their wages. Tonight, however, Clara remained lucid enough to think, or rather, to drift through thoughts softened at the edges. She wondered if the cordial was changing her. She wondered if her husband noticed the new hollowness in her cheeks, the tremor in her hands when she poured tea, the distant look in her eyes that seemed to belong to someone watching life through glass. He had not said a word. Thinness delighted him. Fragility, even more. Clara exhaled slowly, her breath forming a faint cloud in the cool room. She placed the bottle back in the drawer, its weight familiar, its promise already pulling at her. She lay down, letting the cordial guide her into a heavy, dreamless half-sleep. Outside, the fog pressed against the windows. Inside, Clara floated, numb and weightless, unaware that each night's decision carved her further from herself. The cordial waited in the drawer, patient, forgiving, and hungry for tomorrow. The brass bell above the door of Dr. James Brackley's Harley Street practice chimed with a gentle, well-mannered ring, the sort of sound designed to soothe patients before they even stepped foot inside. The waiting room smelled faintly of camphor, old leather, and the lingering perfume of women who passed through each morning like anxious shadows. Lace gloves rested in trembling hands. Parasols leaned against chairs. Pale faces peered over handkerchiefs, embroidered with initials from England's finest families. Dr. Brackley prided himself on order. The gas lamps were always trimmed, the carpets were always brushed. His ledgers were immaculate, but most impressive of all were the glass cabinets standing behind his desk, each filled with bottles, powders, and tinctures arranged like soldiers at attention. Remedies for every ailment or so, the doctor claimed. Mrs. Lillian Ashcroft arrived precisely at 10 o'clock. She always did. She moved with the delicate slowness of a woman whose corset allowed only shallow breaths, and whose body carried more secrets than her narrowed waist suggested. Her cheeks were pale, her eyes too bright, her hands encased in gloves that trembled faintly as she lowered herself into the patient's chair. Dr. Brackley did not remark on her condition. He rarely did. "What seems to trouble you this week, Mrs. Ashcroft?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "Oh, the usual," she murmured. "A faintness, a lack of appetite, a touch of sleeplessness." She recited these symptoms as though listing the weather predictable, expected, gentle enough to hide the truth. He nodded with the practiced gravity of a man listening to the thousandth echo of the same quiet confession. "And the tonic has been helping?" "Yes," she whispered. "Very much so." Of course it helped. Cocaine dissolved into sweetened wine could make even the most exhausted socialite feel reborn for a time. And when that bliss dimmed, opium cordial waited in the night to carry them through the darker hours. Victorian medicine called them remedies. Society called them refinement. Neither name acknowledged what they truly were. Dr. Brackley opened a drawer and removed a fresh bottle of Coca tonic, its label written in clean, authoritative script for nerves, appetite, and female weakness. It sparkled faintly in the lamplight, more precious than perfume, more dangerous than any poison openly sold. He placed it before her with a gentle smile. This should provide relief. She reached for it with the eagerness of someone grasping a lifeline, not realizing the lifeline was tugging her further out to sea. The doctor did not ask why her hands shook. He did not ask why she had lost so much weight that her wedding ring slid loosely over bone. He did not ask why her eyes had taken on that wide, restless gleam common among women who relied too heavily on his remedies. Such questions complicated business. In truth, Dr. Brackley saw dozens of women just like her, each week wives, debutantes, widows, ladies of influence, whose frail beauty society adored. The slimmer they became, the more praise they received. The more praise they received, the more they returned to him. It was a quiet arrangement, a mutually convenient one, upheld by social expectations and unspoken desperation. He wrote a few notes in her chart, meaningless scribbles meant to reassure, and escorted her to the door with polite ceremony. She stepped back into the fog-dim street, the bottle secure in her gloved hand, her breath already growing easier at the thought of relief waiting inside it. Dr. Brackley returned to his desk, adjusted the lamp, and prepared for his next patient. Another woman would enter. Another faint voice would murmur of hunger lost, sleep stolen, nerves frayed, and he would offer another bottle with the same steady smile. He never asked why. Victorian society did not want him to. The Whitmore salon gleamed like a porcelain jewel box that afternoon, filled with soft laughter, rustling skirts, and the gentle clinking of silver spoons against china. Sunlight filtered through tall, lace-draped windows, lending the room a warm, golden hush that made every woman appear softer, more graceful, almost ethereal. On the long table, the luncheon was laid out with the precision of a painter's still life: glazed pastries, crisp cucumber sandwiches, tiny cakes decorated with sugared violets, and tea steeped to the shade of amber silk. And yet almost none of it would be eaten. Lady Margaret Elwell sat among her peers, her gloved hands folded neatly in her lap, her smile poised in its proper place. Her eyes drifted toward the untouched plates before them, noticing how pastries remained intact except for the faintest indent of curiosity from someone's fork, how sandwiches were lifted only for politeness before being returned, how cups of tea cooled long before reaching lips. Hunger was unwelcome at such gatherings, appetite unfashionable. Discipline, or the illusion of it, was the true mark of refinement. Margaret felt her stomach tighten with a faint ache, a reminder of the breakfast she had skipped and the tonic she had dissolved beneath her tongue instead. The cocaine had dulled the edge of her hunger, leaving her with a soft, artificial clarity that made the room feel brighter, the voices sharper, her thoughts detached and drifting like dust motes in the sun. Across from her, Lady Charlotte Harwood laughed behind her fan, her waist impossibly slender, her face luminous with the brittle glow so common among women who maintained their health with the same secret assistance. Margaret caught the tremor in Charlotte's hand as she set the fan down. Only someone living the same quiet war would have noticed. "Do try a cake, Lady Elwell," murmured Mrs. Harding from Margaret's left, her tone sweetly insincere. "You've grown so wonderfully slim, but one treat won't undo it." Margaret smiled politely, ignoring the faint pressure behind the comment, the suggestion that thinness, once gained, must be guarded with vigilance. "Perhaps later," she replied. "I find I have little appetite today." "Ah," Mrs. Harding said knowingly. "The season wears us all down, doesn't it?" But Margaret knew it was not the season that stole her appetite. It was the powder, the tonic, the tightening of expectations around her ribs, as surely as her corset did. Victorian society praised restraint in all forms, but none more fervently than the restraint of hunger, a quiet, invisible suffering transformed into elegance. The luncheon continued with gentle conversation, each remark polished like cut glass. The women spoke of opera performances, new carriages, the latest Parisian fabrics, but beneath the surface, another conversation simmered, unspoken and universal. Who was losing weight? Who had fainted at last week's gathering? Who had acquired that coveted look of delicate exhaustion? Thinness had become the currency by which women measured one another. It granted admiration, status, envy, and so luncheon plates remained untouched, not out of fullness, but out of fear. Fear that indulgence would thicken the waist, dull the cheekbones, invite judgment whispered behind gloved hands. Margaret lifted her teacup, though she barely tasted the liquid. Her heart fluttered strangely, a side effect of the tonic, she suspected, but she kept her expression serene. That was the rule. No matter how hollow the body felt, the face must remain luminous. A maid passed behind her, replacing plates and pouring more tea. She glanced, just briefly, at the uneaten food. Her eyes flickered with something like pity, but she said nothing. Servants had learned that these women, splendid in silk and lace, nourished themselves on something far more poisonous than bread and butter. When the luncheon ended, the table stood nearly as pristine as it had been before the guests arrived, a feast admired but abandoned. The women drifted from the room like pale, drifting phantoms, delicate and disciplined, upheld by powders and pride. Margaret stepped into the afternoon light, her hunger stirring faintly beneath the tonic's veil. She ignored it, as she had been taught. Thinness was not merely fashionable, it was demanded. And in Victorian London, demands often became chains disguised as ribbons. The chemist's shop on Regent Street was a curious refuge, equal parts medical haven and fashionable boutique, where marble counters gleamed beneath polished brass lamps, and the air smelled faintly of eucalyptus, lavender, and something far sharper that lingered in the shadows of the shelves. Ladies of distinction entered through its glass doors with lowered veils and cautious steps, as if visiting a place both indispensable and faintly forbidden. Mr. Theodore Hemsley, the chemist himself, stood behind the counter like a guardian of elegant secrets. His spectacles perched perfectly upon the bridge of his nose. His waistcoat was immaculate. His voice carried the soothing cadence of a man who had long ago learned the value of discretion. And discretion, here, was his true currency. It was mid-afternoon when Mrs. Evelyn Radcliffe entered the shop, her presence announced not by words, but by the soft rustle of silk and the faint perfume that always accompanied her violet, with a whisper of something bittersweet beneath. Her eyes were hidden behind a lace veil. Though Mr. Hemsley recognized her instantly, he recognized them all. "Good day, Mrs. Radcliffe," he greeted, his tone warm but muted. "A pleasure to see you again." She inclined her head. Her gloved hand rested on the polished counter, trembling ever so slightly. "Good day, Mr. Hemsley. I require another bottle of the invigorating tonic, the one you prepared last month." "Of course," he replied, as though she had requested nothing more consequential than a jar of cold cream. "You found it helpful?" "It keeps me steady." A pause, and light. Light, the word so many women used when they meant thin. The chemist's eyes flickered with understanding, though he did not comment. Victorian propriety demanded silence around such matters. So did profit. Mr. Hemsley turned to the glass cabinet behind him, unlocking it with a small brass key. Inside stood rows of delicate bottles filled with liquids of varying hues, pale gold, rose pink, clear as ice. Labels bore reassuring phrases: for nervous tension, for spirits and strength, for appetite management, and the most popular among his clientele, for ladies' well-being. He retrieved a slim bottle filled with a barely tinted solution. Cocaine-infused elixir, disguised in sweetness, perfected in secrecy. He added a few drops of tincture to it, swirling the bottle with practiced grace until the liquid shimmered faintly, like pearled water. As he worked, Evelyn drifted through the shop, her gaze lingering on jars of medicinal powders, glass vials, tiny envelopes of herbs. She paused before a display of new slimming lozenges, packaged in ornate tins decorated with roses and gold filigree. The advertisement proclaimed them a gentle aid for women seeking refinement of figure. The wording was delicate, deceitful, irresistible. "How remarkable," she murmured, fingertips brushing the tin. "They are quite popular," Mr. Hemsley said as he returned with her prepared elixir, "though the tonic you favor is more reliable." She accepted the bottle, its weight small but significant in her gloved hand. "Yes, it helps me maintain composure, especially during the season." Composure. He knew what that meant too. The women who came to him, elegant, pale, hollow-cheeked, were expected to glide effortlessly through assemblies, balls, teas, and luncheons with the grace of creatures untouched by earthly needs. And if hunger gnawed beneath their corsets, if exhaustion tightened their breaths, if their hearts fluttered like trapped birds, the tonic ensured they would never show it. Money exchanged hands discreetly. No prescriptions were required, no questions were asked. "Do take only a small teaspoon at a time," Mr. Hemsley advised, though both knew the bottle would be empty long before the month ended. "And if you should need more, I know where to find you." Her voice held a fragile gratitude. As she left the shop, the bell chimed gently, its sound swallowed quickly by the fog outside. Mr. Hemsley watched her go, noting the slight sway in her step, not drunkenness, but fragility dressed as poise. He had seen the same walk countless times. Behind him, the shelves stood silent, filled with solutions to ailments society refused to acknowledge. Solutions that thinned bodies, quieted minds, and hollowed lives, all while maintaining the illusion of delicate perfection. On Regent Street, the chemist's shop remained a sanctuary of refinement. The nursery on Grosvenor Square glowed with the soft, amber hush of evening, a refuge of rocking chairs, embroidered blankets, and the sweet, milky warmth of infancy. Toys rested in orderly rows. The cradle swayed with the gentlest rhythm, stirred by a draught from the half-open window. It was a peaceful room by every measure, yet inside its quiet walls, Mrs. Lydia Fairborn sat upright in a velvet chair, her hands gripping the armrests as though bracing against an invisible storm. It was nearly 2 a.m. The house was silent except for the ticking of the long-case clock in the hallway and the occasional sigh from the baby sleeping nearby. But Lydia did not sleep. She had not slept, not truly, for weeks. Her eyes were rimmed with the faintest bruised shadows beneath the powder. Her breath came too quickly, her thoughts too sharply. If she closed her eyes, even for a moment, the world spun, bright and fevered. The tonic made sure of that. On the small table beside her chair sat an almost empty vial of cocaine elixir, its stopper loose, its scent faintly sweet and medicinal. In the drawer below lay a bottle of laudanum cordial, its opium black liquid glinting like ink. These 2 bottles had become her impossible balance, one to lift her through the day, one to drag her into an imitation of sleep. Tonight, she relied on the former. Lydia's fingers trembled as she lifted the vial, tipping the last few drops beneath her tongue. The familiar sting spread across her mouth before dissolving into a bloom of artificial clarity. Her heart quickened. The fog in her mind thinned. The exhaustion that had been pulling at her bones retreated, forced into the corners of the room like a scolded servant. She exhaled shakily, eyes drifting toward the cradle. Her daughter, small and perfect, slept swaddled in white muslin. Lydia adored her with an intensity that frightened her at times, a fierce, aching love, sharpened by pressures she could not name aloud. A mother, society said, must stay radiant. A mother must remain slim, graceful, untroubled. A mother must never display the exhaustion that choked her every hour. And so Lydia hid her trembling hands beneath lace cuffs. She hid her sleepless nights beneath powder and rouge. She hid her hunger beneath polite refusals at the table. She hid her unraveling behind the tonic, the cordial, the expectation that a lady's suffering must always appear beautiful. Her husband noticed none of it. He saw only the delicate elegance she maintained, the slender waist returned too soon after childbirth, the quiet composure, the luminous eyes. He did not see how those eyes stayed open long after the household slept, dilated with stimulant, unable to close without the heavy pull of opium. The clock chimed the half-hour. Lydia rose slowly, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. The room wavered at the edges, not from fatigue, but from the unnatural stillness the tonic allowed. She crossed to the cradle and brushed her fingertips over her daughter's cheek, marveling at how peaceful the little one seemed. "Sleep well, darling," she whispered, her voice thin and frayed. The baby shifted, but did not wake. Lydia stood there a long time, watching the tiny chest rise and fall, envying the uncomplicated rhythm of her child's rest. How effortless it looked, how distant it felt. Behind her, the vial on the table gleamed beneath the lamplight, its emptiness a quiet accusation. She knew she would return to the chemist tomorrow. She knew the doctor would renew her cordial without question. She knew she would continue smiling through her fatigue, gliding through society events like a pale, elegant spectre. It was expected. She returned to the velvet chair, folded her hands in her lap, and stared into the dim room, her thoughts racing too quickly to quiet. Sleep would not come for hours unless she opened the drawer and reached for the darker bottle waiting there. She didn't. Not yet. Instead, she sat alone in the nursery's golden stillness, a mother awake in a world that adored her fragility more than her well-being. And the night, like so many before it, stretched on without mercy. The writing desk in Miss Isabel Hawthorne's bedroom was a masterpiece of carved walnut, polished to a mirror-like sheen that caught the morning light in soft, amber ripples. Upon it lay her inkpot, her quills, a pressed flower bookmark, and a slim diary bound in deep green leather, its corners worn from frequent handling, its pages scented faintly of lavender, and something darker that clung to the fibers like a whispered secret. The diary was Isabel's most private confidant. It held her fears, her ambitions, her doubts, and her quiet unraveling, though much of that unraveling had never been written in ink. Some pages were missing, torn carefully, meticulously, so the binding would not appear damaged. Removed on nights she could not quite remember. Removed after mornings when her reflection looked unfamiliar, her thoughts tangled, her hands shaking as she attempted to reconstruct the memories lost to tonic-induced brightness or laudanum softened oblivion. This morning, as she sat before the desk, her lamp still glowing weakly in the dull London mist, Isabel opened the diary to a marked page and stared at the jagged space where 3 entries should have been. She did not recall tearing them out. She only recalled the echo of last night's feelings, a jittery restlessness in her limbs, a sense of floating through her own rooms, and the slow, warm drop of laudanum she had swallowed to silence both her pulse and her thoughts. Her hand hovered over the empty space. She felt the tight pull of her corset when she exhaled. The world seemed sharper today, edges too defined, the silence too loud. She glanced toward the small glass vial at the edge of her desk. Her morning coca tonic, glimmering faintly, enticing as always. She did not reach for it. Not yet. Instead, she dipped her quill into the inkpot, willing her hand to steady. She wrote slowly, cautiously, as if her own words might betray her. I feel as though I am losing pieces of myself. It is as if the nights swallow my memory whole. The line trembled across the page, the letters slightly uneven. She paused. Outside her window, the fog pressed against the glass like a tired thing seeking warmth. Somewhere below, hooves clattered across the street, followed by the faint chatter of flower sellers beginning their rounds. Life continued with its usual Victorian elegance, muffled, orderly, cold. Isabel resumed writing. I do not know what was said at the Harding supper. They tell me I seemed pale, delicately fatigued, was the phrase. I cannot recall the carriage ride home. I cannot recall climbing the stairs. I only know I awoke with powder on my lips and a heaviness in my head. Her quill hesitated. She looked down at her wrist, faint bruises from tightening her corset without assistance, evidence of the frantic energy that sometimes seized her after taking too much tonic, evidence she'd hidden beneath gloves at church. She wrote again, slower this time. The pages were missing when I awoke. Did I tear them myself? I must have. Yet I cannot bear the thought of what I wrote. Her breath trembled. She closed the diary for a moment, pressing her palm against the leather cover as though steadying a heartbeat. On the vanity across the room, her reflection stared back, wide-eyed, hollow-cheeked, beautiful in the way society adored, fragile, breakable, effortlessly thin. It was a beauty Isabel had chased, won, and now feared. A beauty maintained by secrets, powders, and pages torn from the truth. She reopened the diary, turned to a fresh leaf, and wrote one final line. If I continue like this, I will lose more than pages. The thought hung in the air, heavy and undeniably true. At last, as the morning bell rang downstairs to signal breakfast, a meal she would not touch, Isabel reached for the vial of tonic. Her hand shook slightly, but her resolve did not. The powder would brighten her mind, sharpen her smile, steady her steps. It would also take another piece of her, but in Victorian London, a woman could sacrifice nearly everything so long as she appeared perfectly, fashionably thin. She uncorked the vial. The day began. The corridors of the Ellington residence were long and hushed, lined with portraits of solemn ancestors whose painted eyes followed every passer-by with an air of quiet disapproval. The carpets muffled footsteps, the gas lamps flickered with studied restraint, and every hour of the day unfolded according to a schedule more rigid than any schoolroom. Yet within these orderly walls, Miss Harriet Linden, governess, confidante, and silent witness, carried a burden heavier than any lesson book. Harriet moved like a shadow through the house, her dark gown blending into the heavy drapery, her presence barely noted by the family she served. She taught French to the eldest girl, arithmetic to the younger, and needlework to the child who could not sit still. She kept the children tidy, disciplined, polite, and she kept their mother's secret. She had discovered it by accident. One late morning, after escorting the children to the garden for their hour of fresh air, Harriet returned to the drawing room to retrieve her forgotten gloves. Mrs. Lucinda Ellington had not heard her enter. She stood before the mirror, hands trembling as she lifted a small tin from her reticule. Harriet froze, unseen in the doorway, as Lucinda dipped a tiny silver spoon into the tin and tipped the powder beneath her tongue. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable. Lucinda's shoulders loosened, her eyes sharpened with an unnatural brightness, and her breath, moments earlier shallow and uneven, steadied into perfect composure. Harriet understood at once. She had seen the same powdered glimmer on shelves in town chemists, wrapped in elegant labels designed for women of stature. She had heard whispers among London's servants, quiet exchanges in kitchens, laundries, and coach houses describing the peculiar habits of ladies who stayed thin as reeds and drifted through rooms like pale, restless spirits. And now she knew her mistress was one of them. From that day on, Harriet saw everything. The untouched dinner trays carried back to the kitchen, the sleepless pacing behind closed doors, the faint tremor in Lucinda's hands when she poured tea, the way she pressed her fingers to her temples during lessons, eyes darting with nervous energy, the powder on her lips in the morning, the glassy stillness at night from a different bottle entirely. Harriet said nothing. A governess lived in the delicate space between servant and family, trusted enough to raise children, but not trusted enough to speak of what she knew. Her livelihood depended on silence. Her respectability hung by a single thread, and Lucinda, in her fragile elegance, relied on that silence more each day. One evening, when the children had retired and Harriet was tidying the schoolroom, she heard a soft gasp from the hallway. Lucinda had collapsed against the wall, one hand clutching the banister, her skin pale as parchment. Harriet rushed to her side. "Mrs. Ellington, are you unwell?" Lucinda forced a smile, her breath quick and shallow. "Just a moment's faintness. The season has been so demanding." But Harriet could see the truth in her eyes: fear, exhaustion, dependence. Gently, she helped her mistress to her room, all the while pretending to believe the excuse. When she left, she noticed the half-empty vial on the nightstand, its amber contents catching the lamplight like a sinister jewel. Later, in her small attic bedroom, Harriet sat on the edge of her narrow bed, staring at the moonlit ceiling. She knew what laudanum did to people. She had lost a cousin to it, a milliner's apprentice who started with sleeping draughts and ended with trembling hands and breath that rattled like broken glass. She had sworn she would never again watch someone she cared for descend that path. And yet here she was, powerless once more. She could tell no one. Not the master who prized his wife's thin, delicate appearance. Not the physician who would simply prescribe more. Not even Lucinda herself, because ladies of stature did not accept advice from governesses. So Harriet kept the secret. She tucked the children into bed each night, praying their mother's hollowed fragility would not one day steal her from them. She watched Lucinda through lowered eyes, noting every tremor, every shadow, every brittle smile. She offered quiet assistance when she could, though never enough to break the unspoken boundaries of class. She lived between truth and silence, bearing witness to the slow, poison-sweet unraveling of a woman society demanded remain lovely at any cost. And each day she wondered how long a secret could be kept before it shattered like the women who carried it. The mirror in Lady Beatrice Harland's dressing room was an exquisite thing, an oval of polished, silvered glass, framed in carved cherrywood, adorned with small mother-of-pearl inlays that shimmered like droplets of frozen light. It had been imported from Paris years ago, a wedding gift from her husband, who remarked that such a mirror would do justice to her beauty. Beatrice had loved it then, she feared it now. Morning light crept through the silk curtains, diffused and gentle, settling over Beatrice as she stood before the glass in her corset and chemise. Her breathing came in tight, shallow pulls as she examined her reflection. The mirror was honest, painfully so. It showed the sharpness in her cheekbones, the faint bluish shadows beneath her eyes, the slimness of her arms that no tailor could disguise beneath lace sleeves. And yet, in Victorian London, this was considered the height of refinement. Thinness was not merely fashionable, it was required, and the mirror reflected that requirement back at her with merciless clarity. Beatrice lifted a hand to her face, brushing fingertips against skin that felt strangely cold, despite the warmth of the room. Her maid, Claire, hovered nearby, holding Beatrice's morning gown at the ready. She kept her gaze lowered, but Beatrice sensed her concern, a subtle tightening of her posture, a faint hesitation before speaking. "Shall I lace you further, my lady?" Claire asked softly. Beatrice's voice emerged faint and breathy. "Yes, a little tighter." Claire obeyed. The corset tightened. Beatrice's ribs protested. Her vision blurred just slightly around the edges. But when Claire stepped back, Beatrice turned once more to the mirror. The waist looked smaller. The form looked lighter. The mirror approved. Society would approve. Still, something within her recoiled. She leaned closer, gripping the carved frame. The glass whispered back an image of a woman who appeared almost spectral, elegant, yes, but hollowed, a wisp of her former vitality. Her eyes were too bright, their glow unnatural. Her lips had taken on a faint tremble. Her shoulders curved inward, as if bracing against a cold she alone could feel. The tonic had sharpened her appetite for vanity. The opium had dulled her appetite for living. Beatrice swallowed, her throat dry. On the vanity table beside her lay the tools of the illusion: powder puffs, rouge pots, kohl pencils, and a small crystal box containing the white cocaine powder that quickened her pulse and softened her hunger. Next to it sat a tiny vial of laudanum she reserved for the evenings, when the tonic's brightness collapsed into a leaden weariness. It was a cycle she could not name aloud, not even to herself. Claire approached hesitantly. "My lady, you've eaten very little these past days. Perhaps—" Beatrice cut her off gently, her tone polite but brittle. "I am perfectly well." The lie echoed between them. The mirror reflected it without question. Mirrors did not judge. They simply returned what they saw, which, of course, was not always the truth. Beatrice lifted the crystal box, her fingers steady only because the tonic still lingered in her system from the night before. She dabbed the smallest bit of powder onto her tongue, letting the cold sting dissolve. The effect was immediate. Her heartbeat sharpened, her posture straightened, the fog in her mind receded. She smiled. It was thin. It was beautiful. It was false. Claire pretended not to notice. Beatrice slipped into her gown, the silk gliding over her slight frame like mist over a river. She moved with practiced grace toward the door, ready to face a day of luncheons she would not eat and compliments she would not believe. As she turned, she glanced once more at the mirror. For a heartbeat, she saw not herself, but the woman she used to be, fuller-faced, bright-eyed, alive. Then the reflection flickered back into its new shape, the fragile silhouette society praised. The mirror did not lie. It showed precisely what Victorian beauty did. The apothecary on St. James's Lane stood beneath a wrought-iron sign, shaped like a mortar and pestle, its windows fogged with the faint breath of tinctures and warming cabinets. The interior glowed with an amber softness, like candlelight trapped in glass. Shelves rose from floor to ceiling, crowded with bottles labeled in elegant script: tincture of lavender, elixir of nerves, syrup of poppy, essence of coca leaf, tonic for feminine frailty. The place had a fragrance all its own, part medicine, part perfume, part something indefinably bittersweet. Behind the counter stood Mr. Percival Ashcroft, an apothecary of respectable breeding and immaculate grooming. His silver watch chain glinted in the lamplight, his moustache curled in perfect symmetry, his hands, pale and steady, moved with the soft assurance of a man who dealt not merely in remedies, but in quiet necessities, and his smile, gentle, practiced, reassuring, concealed more than any bottle behind him. The shop bell rang, its chiming delicate as glass. Lady Helena Sinclair stepped inside, her expression tense beneath her lace veil. She paused to compose herself before approaching the counter. She always did. "Good afternoon, Lady Sinclair," Mr. Ashcroft greeted warmly. "A pleasure, as always. How may I assist you today?" Helena's gloved hand tightened around the handle of her parasol. Her voice, when it emerged, was soft and brittle. "The same tonic as before, Mr. Ashcroft, if you have it." "Of course." His smile widened just enough to convey understanding without suggestion. He turned to the cabinet behind him, selecting a bottle filled with a faintly opalescent liquid. As he measured out the ingredients: coca leaf extract, refined sugar syrup, a whisper of alcohol, Helena pretended to examine a display of scented oils, though her gaze drifted repeatedly back toward the tonic, her breath shallow with anticipation. "Has your appetite improved at all?" Mr. Ashcroft asked lightly as he worked. Helena stiffened. "I suppose not. But that is hardly a concern." "No concern at all," he agreed smoothly. "Many ladies prefer to maintain a light diet. The tonic simply assists in one's natural refinement." Refinement, such a pleasant word for decline. Helena lowered her gaze. She knew what the tonic did. She knew how quickly it lifted her from exhaustion into a glittering calm, how effortlessly it stole her hunger, how sharp and bright her thoughts became after a single dose. She knew how it left her trembling at dusk, desperate for the laudanum waiting in her nightstand. And yet she returned, again and again, because society applauded her fragile silhouette as though it were an accomplishment. Mr. Ashcroft corked the bottle and wrapped it in soft paper. "There we are," he said, sliding it toward her. "Remember a teaspoon before breakfast and another before supper. Only as needed, of course." "Yes," she murmured, accepting it quickly, clutching it as one might clutch a lifeline. As she paid, her glove brushed lightly against his hand. Mr. Ashcroft felt the faintest tremor in her fingers, a telltale flutter he recognized from countless customers. He offered no reaction. His smile remained serene, charitable, immaculate. When Helena left, the bell chimed again, and the air settled into its usual perfumed stillness. Moments later, another woman entered, then another, and another. Some wore veils to hide the pallor in their cheeks. Some kept their heads bowed, ashamed yet eager. Some looked almost feverish with need. Mr. Ashcroft greeted each one with the same gentle smile, the same soothing voice, the same unspoken understanding. He never asked why their waists dwindled by the week. He never asked why their hands trembled or why their eyes glowed with unnatural light. He never asked why they returned sooner each time, or why their purchases grew larger, or why their faces seemed to collapse into delicate angles. His business depended on such silence, And in Victorian London, a city obsessed with refinement, the apothecary's smile was worth more than any prescription. It was permission, it was denial, it was the first step in a descent disguised as elegance. On the low mahogany table in Lady Prudence Ashcomb's morning room sat a neat stack of the Ladies' Household Review, the Illustrated London Society, and the Monthly Gazette for Gentlewomen. Their pastel covers displayed roses, cherubs, and elegant silhouettes, a world of propriety and polished domesticity. But tucked among the embroidery patterns and etiquette advice were advertisements far more alluring than any recipe for blancmange or instructions for laundering lace. Lady Prudence flipped open the newest issue with idle grace, her corset pinching sharply beneath the silk of her gown. As she scanned the pages, her eyes paused predictably, irresistibly on a coloured advertisement near the centrefold. It depicted a serene woman with luminous eyes, a swan-like neck, and a waist so slender it seemed a miracle of anatomy. Beneath her gloved hand, she held a bottle embossed with gilt lettering. Dr. Haldon's Refined Figure Elixir, a gentle remedy for appetite, spirits, and feminine fatigue. Endorsed by prominent ladies of society. Prudence exhaled a wistful breath. There it was again, the promise wrapped in pink borders and printed in dainty script. The very tonic her friends whispered about during fittings, the one servants found tucked discreetly in vanity drawers. She brushed the advertisement lightly with her fingertips, as though touching it might bring her closer to the woman depicted within. The model's eyes sparkled with an unnatural brightness she recognized. Prudence had seen that glow in the mirror. The elixir claimed to restore energy, lighten spirits, and gently quiet the troublesome appetite that so plagues the modern woman. The wording was delicate, but the meaning unmistakable. Society adored women who seemed too refined, too delicate, too ethereal for earthly needs, and the elixir, like so many others, quietly helped them achieve that impossible illusion. She turned the page, but her mind lingered. On the opposite leaf, another advertisement caught her attention. Laudanum lozenges for sleep, nerves, and ladies' melancholy. The lozenges came in tins decorated with violets and gilt scrolls, looking more like sweetmeats than a dangerous opium confection. Victorians had a way of making poisons charming. She lifted her teacup, but did not sip. The tea had grown cold. Her stomach fluttered not with hunger, but with the familiar jittery discomfort that came from the powdered tonic she'd taken that morning. She told herself the sensation was nothing, a small price for beauty. Her maid, Anna, entered quietly to gather laundry. Prudence noticed the girl's eyes flicker toward the newspapers, not with interest in society gossip, but with the subtle fear of someone who has witnessed too much. Anna had seen her mistress collapse once, during a fitting. She had seen the trembling, the pale lips, the vial slipping from Prudence's pocket. But she had said nothing. Servants learned early the cost of speaking truths their employers avoided. When Anna left, Prudence returned her attention to the journal. She reread the advertisement, each line tugging at the delicate threads of her insecurities. Restores luminous complexion. Favoured by ladies of refinement. Ensures elegance of figure without harsh abstinence. Harsh abstinence, the phrase almost made her laugh. Prudence's meals had long since become performances. Nibbling at watercress, rearranging pastries, sipping broth until her husband praised her admirable restraint. She wondered if he noticed how her rings slid on her fingers now, how her gowns required constant taking in, how her nights were spent staring at the ceiling, her heart racing in time with the stimulant that perched beneath her ribs like a restless bird. The journal pages fluttered in a small draught. Prudence set down her teacup and folded the advertisement carefully, slipping it into a drawer of her escritoire. A reminder, a reassurance, a lifeline. By late afternoon, she would order another bottle. By evening, she would drink it. By morning, she would praise its effects. The elixir was everywhere, in journals, in chemists, in whispered endorsements at garden parties. It had become a quiet companion to the Victorian woman, a friend, a poison, a promise. As Prudence stood and glided toward the window, sunlight illuminating the hollow curve of her cheeks, she could not decide whether the elixir made her feel more alive or more ghost-like. But the advertisement had done its work. She would return to the bottle, and Victorian society obsessed with fragile perfection would applaud her for it. The tea room at Claridge's shimmered beneath chandeliers shaped like inverted bouquets, each crystal droplet catching the afternoon light and scattering it across the room in delicate fragments. The walls were painted a pale dove grey, the table linens crisp and white, the air perfumed with bergamot, rosewater, and the faint, lingering sweetness of pastries too beautiful to eat. It was a haven of gentility, or so it seemed to those who merely passed through. Lady Eleanor Whitcomb and Mrs. Charlotte Harwood sat at a small round table near the window, their gloves folded neatly, their parasols resting against their chairs. To any casual observer, they appeared the very image of Victorian refinement, elegant, composed, serene. Only someone looking closely would notice the truth. The way Charlotte's spoon trembled slightly as she stirred her tea, or how Eleanor kept her hands clasped tightly in her lap to steady their faint, persistent shaking. The tonic did that. So did the hunger. The waiter approached with quiet efficiency, setting a tiered tray of delicacies before them. Rose macarons, almond cakes, lemon tarts dusted with sugar. Each treat glowed like a jewel beneath the afternoon sun. "I do wish I felt hungry," Charlotte murmured with an airy laugh, though her smile was strained. "But I suppose one must be grateful. Slimness comes at a price, does it not?" Eleanor nodded, her throat tightening. She reached for her teacup and lifted it carefully, mindful of the tremor she prayed would not betray her. The steam rose in faint curls, warming her face. She took a small sip and hoped it looked effortless. Around them, the tea room buzzed with soft chatter. Ladies in pastel gowns leaned close, whispering about the latest opera, the scandalous divorce filed in Mayfair, the Duchess who had collapsed at the season's opening ball. "Poor nerves," they said, though everyone understood what poor nerves meant in their world. Near the far window sat Lady Pembroke, renowned for her ethereal beauty. Her waist appeared so narrow it seemed almost sculpted. She lifted a teacup with hands that shook so violently the porcelain rattled. Her companion pretended not to notice. Eleanor watched her for a moment. A pang of recognition or perhaps warning flickered through her chest. Charlotte leaned in. "I heard she takes 2 spoonfuls of the coca elixir before breakfast," she whispered, "and laudanum at night to counter the effects. One must balance these things." Balance. As if their daily routine resembled some delicate chemical equation rather than a quiet descent. Eleanor placed her cup back on its saucer, the porcelain making a soft click. Her fingers tingled, her heartbeat fluttering in irregular bursts. She felt light, almost untethered. The tonic always made her feel that way in crowded rooms, as though she were hovering slightly above her own body, performing the gestures of elegance without fully inhabiting them. Charlotte reached for a macaron but set it down immediately when her hand shook too visibly. She laughed again, brittle. "My nerves are unsteady today. I barely slept." "You should take a walk in the park later," Eleanor suggested, though her voice trembled just as Charlotte's hands had. "Perhaps fresh air will help." Charlotte's eyes flickered with the faintest glint of panic. "I cannot. I took a dose before luncheon. If I walk too long, I'll feel faint." Eleanor dropped her gaze. She understood. The tonic quieted appetite but sharpened fragility. The women who depended on it lived in a careful choreography of dosages and disguises. Too much, and they trembled. Too little, and hunger clawed through the illusion. Each day became a performance of calm, of beauty, of frailty that Victorian society applauded as femininity. Eleanor lifted her teacup once more, willing her hands to remain steady. Through the window, a carriage passed. the horses' hooves echoing faintly against the street. For a moment, she imagined herself inside it, driven far from Claridge's, far from expectations, far from the trembling pretense of delicate perfection. But the moment passed. Charlotte smoothed her gloves and attempted another sip of tea. "You look well today, Eleanor," she said gently, though her eyes lingered a fraction too long on the hollow beneath Eleanor's cheekbone. "And you," Eleanor replied, though the lie felt heavy. Around them the chandeliers glimmered. The pastries sat untouched. The tea cooled in their cups. The tremors remained delicate, persistent reminders of the quiet poisons stitched into the seams of Victorian beauty. And the tea room, with all its elegance, became another stage where women performed the fragile roles society demanded, while slowly unraveling beneath silk and lace. The Montrose estate in Kensington was a palace in miniature gilded staircases, marble floors, and ceilings painted with angels who gazed down upon the living with frozen serenity. But no ornament was admired more than its greatest treasure, Miss Arabella Montrose, only daughter, future heiress, and shining ornament of her mother's relentless ambition. Arabella had once been vibrant. Her laughter used to ring through the house like a silver bell. She had cheeks flushed with youth, hair that tumbled down her back in dark, glossy curls, and a step that skipped rather than glided. But society had a way of dimming such brightness. It did not want vibrant young women. It wanted delicate ones, pale, slender, exquisite, fragile as fine porcelain. And so, Arabella was shaped to fit that ideal, or rather, starved into it. On this particular morning, she sat before her vanity, wrapped in a faint blue dressing gown trimmed with lace. The sunlight that filtered through the curtains caught the delicate angles of her face, angles that had grown sharper in recent months, as if the light itself had carved them. Her cheeks, once round with youthful softness, were now sculpted hollows. Her eyes, wide and luminous, seemed far too large for her thinning face. Her mother stood behind her, supervising every detail of the maid's work. "She looks much improved, don't you think?" Lady Montrose declared, hands clasped with pride. Such refinement, such delicacy. The maid did not answer. She dipped a brush into powder and dusted Arabella's cheeks with faint pink to hide their gauntness. Arabella managed a small smile. "Mama, I feel a little faint." "Nonsense, child. A touch of nerves. You must look your best today. There will be visitors." "Important ones." Lady Montrose smoothed a curl behind her daughter's ear, her touch tender but her gaze appraising. A young woman must understand the power of presentation. In the drawer of the vanity lay a small vial of coca extract hidden beneath folded handkerchiefs. Arabella knew it was there. She also knew her mother would insist she take a dose before luncheon, just as she had insisted during yesterday's fitting and the day before's promenade, and the endless procession of social obligations meant to mold her into an ideal bride. The tonic quieted her hunger, made her feel weightless, dreamy, unconcerned. But when its artificial brightness faded, she shivered with exhaustion, unable to sleep unless she sipped from the laudanum-laced cordial her mother called a gentle nighttime remedy. Arabella lifted her hand to her cheek, surprised again by how sharp it felt, how foreign. "Mama, am I too thin?" Lady Montrose's expression softened into what she believed was reassurance. "My dear, one can never be too thin. Not in London." The maid paused just a flicker, then resumed her task. After her toilette, Arabella descended the grand staircase. Each step felt strangely distant beneath her slippered feet. Her vision blurred at the edges, as though she were watching herself from afar, floating through the house like a ghost rehearsing a memory. In the drawing room, the piano waited open, sheet music arranged with geometric perfection. "You will play something charming when Lord Ashcombe arrives," her mother said. "A young woman must appear graceful, not overeager." Arabella touched the piano keys, her fingers trembling slightly. She remembered when she used to play with joy, when music flowed like breath. Now, each note felt like a performance, each measure a test she must pass. A wave of dizziness washed over her. She gripped the piano's edge until it passed. Lady Montrose noticed but pretended not to. "Good. Fragility suits you wonderfully." Outside, a carriage approached. Inside, the young heiress with hollow cheeks straightened her posture, lifted her chin, and prepared to present herself like an ornament polished to perfection. Her reflection in the piano lid stared back delicate, refined, brittle. Everything society wanted, and nothing she recognized as herself. The ballroom at the Ashford residence shimmered beneath 100 gas lamps, each flame captured within crystal sconces that cast a soft, golden haze across the polished parquet floors. The air was warm with perfume, violets, jasmine, bergamot, and alive with the muted hum of conversation, rustling silk, and the delicate chiming of laughter that sounded just a shade too bright. Miss Eleanor Fairfax stood at the centre of it all, the evening's prized socialite, her presence drifting through the crowded room like the faint scent of roses carried on a late summer breeze. She wore a gown of pale ivory satin, cinched tightly at the waist, its bodice embellished with pearls that gleamed like dewdrops caught in moonlight. Her neck was adorned with a delicate necklace of seed pearls, elegant in its understatement. Everyone noticed her. Everyone admired her. No one saw what she had lost to be admired. Eleanor's figure was the envy of London, impossibly slim, her shoulders fragile as porcelain, her face softly angular beneath the glow of lamplight. But the admiration came at a cost paid in secret. Skipped suppers, untouched breakfasts, luncheons where she merely toyed with watercress while claiming a delicate stomach. And the powders, always the powders that soothed her nerves, banished her hunger, and gave her that bright, buoyant energy that others mistook for charm. She moved through the ballroom with effortless grace, greeting acquaintances with a practiced smile that concealed the faint tremor in her hands. Her heartbeat fluttered beneath her corset like a trapped finch. She had taken a double dose of the coca tonic before the event. The evening ahead demanded stamina she no longer possessed naturally. "Miss Fairfax, you look stunning," Mr. Linden murmured as he bowed over her hand. He was a handsome young gentleman, with polished manners, and a gaze filled with earnest admiration. Eleanor dipped her head in polite acknowledgement, though her vision blurred at the edges of the room. "You are too kind, Mr. Linden. Have you eaten? They say the supper is especially fine this evening," he continued, gesturing toward the grand banquet laid out beyond the archway. A long oak table groaned under roasts glazed in honey, cured ham, miniature pastries, towering fruit arrangements, and pies adorned with sugared flowers. The scent alone was intoxicating. Eleanor's stomach tightened painfully at the thought, not from hunger but from the tonic that silenced hunger so thoroughly she could hardly remember what it felt like. "Oh, I never eat at these affairs," she said lightly. "It is far too warm, you understand." He laughed softly, unaware of the truth hidden between her words. "You have admirable restraint, Miss Fairfax." Restraint, grace, elegance. Those were the virtues society rewarded even when they hollowed a woman from the inside. Eleanor drifted toward the open French doors, the cool night air a relief against her overheating body. Her breath felt shallow beneath her corset. Her pulse had grown erratic too fast, then too faint. Somewhere in the back of her mind, she recognized the signs. She had taken too much. The tonic's brightness now burned almost painfully behind her eyes. She pressed a hand against the stone balustrade of the terrace, steadying herself. In the garden below, lanterns glowed like distant stars among the topiaries. Soft laughter floated upward. The world seemed to tilt. She had forgotten to eat again, not by accident, but by habit. A habit cultivated by praise, by fashion plates, by whispered compliments. by the relentless pursuit of a silhouette so narrow it bordered on the spectral. Behind her, the ballroom's golden glow pulsed like a heartbeat. "Miss Fairfax, are you unwell?" came a gentle voice. Eleanor turned slowly to find Mrs. Harrington, a chaperone with kind eyes, watching her with concern. Concern and emotion rarely directed at women who appeared beautifully fragile. Perhaps a little light-headed," Eleanor admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Come inside at once, you must have something to eat." But Eleanor shook her head, the movement small, exhausted. "I cannot. It will spoil my figure." Mrs. Harrington's face darkened with something like sorrow. She had seen too many young women dim beneath the weight of expectations. Eleanor allowed herself to be guided back toward the ballroom, though she felt as though she were walking on glass. The chandeliers glittered, the orchestra played, the guests twirled in silk and satin, and the socialite at the center of it all admired, adored, applauded, could not remember the last real meal she had eaten, only the praise she had received for avoiding it. In Victorian London, a woman could forget to nourish her body so long as she fed the illusion that society demanded. The brass knocker on Dr. Silas Penworth's private residence gleamed like a polished coin, catching the weak London sunlight as Mrs. Lydia Fairfax approached, her steps slow and hesitant. She had wrapped herself in a dark wool cloak, despite the mild morning. The weight steadied her trembling limbs, and the hood helped conceal her hollowed cheeks from curious passers-by. A lady of her standing preferred not to be seen entering a physician's home, even one as fashionable and discreet as Dr. Penworth. Inside, the house smelled faintly of herbs and brandy, with an undercurrent of something softer and sweeter, laudanum, perhaps, or poppy syrup warming on a burner. The drawing-room had been converted into a kind of genteel consulting chamber. Heavy velvet drapes softened the light, a fire crackled in the hearth, and beside the doctor's desk stood a tray lined with crystal bottles, each filled with a different shade of amber, rose, or pale gold. Dr. Penworth himself was a tall man with silvering hair and a voice as smooth as his silk waistcoat. He greeted Lydia with the same gentle, unhurried manner he used with all the ladies of the upper circle, a tone that suggested not only understanding, but permission. "My dear Mrs. Fairfax," he said, offering her a seat near the fire. "You look fatigued. How long since you last rested properly?" Lydia sat, folding her trembling hands in her lap. "Several nights, I suppose," she murmured. "My nerves will not quiet. My heart feels unsettled." "A common complaint among refined women," he said soothingly. "The demands placed upon you are enormous. A lady's constitution is delicate by nature." Delicate. The word hovered between them like an invisible diagnosis. He crossed to the tray and selected a crystal decanter filled with warm-hued liquid. "I believe the soothing draught we discussed previously may be precisely what you need. A gentle remedy, something to still the nerves and restore your composure." Lydia's gaze drifted to the decanter, to the way the liquid shimmered as it caught the firelight. She recognized the color. Laudanum, laced with ingredients she could not name, tuned to a potency stronger than any bottle found at the chemist, Dr. Penworth's own recipe. His ladies depended on it. She swallowed. Will it help me sleep?" "It will help with everything," he assured her. "Sleep, appetite, mood. It will slow the racing of the heart and quiet all those thoughts that burden you." He poured a measure into a small glass, swirling it slowly before offering it to her. Lydia accepted, though her hands trembled so badly she feared she might spill it. "Only a sip," he cautioned. "A lady must never overindulge in medicines, even those meant to comfort." She brought the glass to her lips. The cordial was warm and sweet, with the faint bitterness of opium blooming beneath the sugar. The effect was immediate, a gentle heaviness spreading through her limbs, the firelight blurring into soft halos. Her shoulders slackened. The tightness in her chest loosened, replaced by a floating warmth that felt almost like relief. Dr. Penworth watched her carefully. "Better?" "Yes," she whispered, her voice distant even to her own ears. "Much better." He nodded with satisfaction. "I shall prepare a bottle for you to take home. A dose before bed, another if needed during the day. But be cautious, Mrs. Fairfax, such remedies are powerful." Powerful, yes. Addictive, absolutely. But he did not speak that word. Lydia placed the empty glass on the table, staring at it as if it held an answer she had been too afraid to seek. She thought of the powder she took to stay thin, the cordial she now accepted to stay calm, the facade she maintained so no one would suspect how brittle she felt inside. Victorian society demanded perfection from its women. Dr. Penworth merely supplied the tools. As she stood to leave, the room seemed to sway beneath her feet gently, like a cradle rocked by a loving hand. The doctor steadied her, guiding her toward the door with the practiced grace of a man who had walked many women through the same haze. Outside, the world was colder, brighter, too sharp. But Lydia clutched the small bottle Dr. Penworth had given her soothing draught, and felt suddenly capable of enduring one more day of refined fragility. After all, in Victorian London, survival often came bottled, sweetened, and prescribed with a reassuring smile. The Harroway Masquerade was the most anticipated event of the season, a glittering, opulent spectacle where London's finest families drifted through rooms awash in candlelight and mystery. The walls of Harroway House were draped in burgundy velvet embroidered with gold thread, and every chandelier cast a soft, shimmering haze as though the entire evening were unfolding through a dream. Music floated from the grand salon violins, a harp, and the faint murmur of waltzing couples gliding as weightlessly as phantoms. Miss Clarissa Vale arrived just past 9 o'clock, her carriage rolling to a gentle stop beneath the great portico. She stepped out swathed in a gown of midnight blue silk, the fabric shimmering with every breath she took. Over her face rested a delicately crafted velvet mask, its edges trimmed with pearls. The mask hid the deeper shadows beneath her eyes, the sharpness in her cheeks, the pallor that powder could not fully disguise. To most, she appeared enchanting, ethereal, light, almost unreal. To herself, she felt as if she might dissolve. Inside, the air was warm with perfume and candle smoke. Servants moved silently at the edges of the room, carrying trays of champagne and sugared confections that sparkled under the lights. Clarissa accepted a glass of champagne but merely let the bubbles rise untouched to the rim. Her stomach fluttered with a faint, uneasy emptiness, the familiar sensation left by the coca tonic she'd taken before dressing. The tonic sharpened her senses. It lifted her mood, smoothed her nerves, and draped everything she saw in a soft, luminous clarity. But the dose had been stronger than intended. Her pulse beat with a faint insistence beneath her corset, and her thoughts fluttered like loose silk caught in a breeze. "Miss Vale," drawled Lord Ellerton as he approached, mask in hand. "You look like a vision tonight, a star fallen from the sky." Clarissa offered a faint smile. "The mask helps," she said lightly, though her voice trembled against the velvet. "Nonsense. You possess a beauty that needs no disguise." If only he knew how hard-won that beauty was purchased through powders, tinctures, and nights spent trembling beneath velvet blankets, her heart racing faster than sleep could catch. But Clarissa merely dipped her head, allowing the illusion to remain intact. As the dance began, couples swept across the floor, gowns swirling like waves of silk. Clarissa let Lord Ellerton lead her into the waltz. At first, the movement felt effortless. She floated, turning gracefully beneath the chandeliers, her mask brushing his shoulder with each rotation. But halfway through the dance, a flicker of weakness shivered through her legs. She faltered. The room tilted momentarily, the lights expanding into bright, blooming halos. Clarissa gripped Lord Ellerton's arm more tightly than decorum allowed. "Are you unwell?" he whispered, concern threading into his voice. She swallowed, forcing steadiness. Just a touch of dizziness. The room is warm, too bright, too loud. The tonic's initial euphoria had begun its descent toward tremor and instability. Ellerton guided her to a quieter alcove draped in velvet, away from the spinning pears and flickering lights. Clarissa steadied herself against a marble column, drawing in slow breaths, shallow, restricted breaths that her corset barely allowed. A servant passed by with a tray of sugared almonds. Clarissa shook her head, though her body ached with faint hunger. Eating would have helped. Eating would have grounded her. But ladies of her standing did not eat at such events, not when thinness commanded admiration. "You should rest," Ellerton urged gently. "No," she murmured. "I could not bear to be seen leaving so early." A flicker of something pity, frustration, crossed his face, but he said nothing. Society had taught him as well as it had taught her. Frailty was a performance, and women accepted their roles willingly or not at all. Clarissa adjusted her velvet mask, the fabric soft but suffocating. She stepped back toward the ballroom, reclaiming her place among the glittering throng. Her hands still trembled, but her posture remained flawless. Her smile held. The illusion persisted. As midnight approached, the masquerade grew ever more radiant, laughter, music, swirling colors blending into something dreamlike. But Clarissa moved through it like a ghost in silk, her body growing lighter, her steps unsteady, her mind floating somewhere just beyond her own reach. No one noticed the brittleness in her gaze. No one questioned the tremor in her fingers. No one wondered why she declined every glass of champagne, every morsel of food. Behind the velvet mask, her beauty gleamed like a candle burning down to its wick. And in the golden haze of Harroway House, the night's splendor concealed the silent truth. Elegance in Victorian society often came at the cost of a woman's stability, hunger, and very pulse, all hidden beneath velvet, lace, and the glow of a ballroom that preferred illusion to reality. The parlor of the Ravenscroft residence was a sanctuary of soft colors and carefully arranged calm pale mint wallpaper, ivory drapery, and a carpet woven with delicate vines of rose and sage. It was the sort of room designed to soothe the mind, to lull anxieties into submission. And yet, for Miss Eleanor Ravenscroft, it had become a chamber of quiet dread, for it was here that her mother insisted she receive her daily cure. Eleanor sat on the chaise near the window, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Outside, a misty drizzle washed over the London streets, blurring the carriages into watercolor shapes. Inside, the fire crackled gently, and the ticking of the mantel clock seemed louder with each passing minute. She knew what was coming. She felt it in the tightening of her chest. She tasted it in the dryness of her tongue. Her mother, Lady Agatha Ravenscroft, entered the room with the soft swish of silk skirts. Regal as ever, with a spine as straight as an iron rod, she carried a small silver tray, upon which rested a glass bottle, the familiar, dreaded bottle filled with a syrupy pink liquid that shimmered as though it held light of its own. "Eleanor, my dear," Lady Agatha said gently, "you've been withdrawn again. Melancholy does not suit a young lady of your promise." Eleanor forced a faint smile. It trembled. "I'm only tired, Mamma." "Oh, nonsense. Tiredness at your age? Impossible. Your nerves are unbalanced. Dr. Solgrave assured me this tonic works wonders for feminine sadness." She set the tray before Eleanor with a flourish, as though presenting a delicacy rather than a dangerous concoction. The bottle's ornate label proclaimed, "Dr. Solgrave's seraphic tonic for melancholy, faintness and disturbances of the feminine disposition." Beneath the angelic script lay the truth Eleanor had learned to fear. Opium and coca, artfully blended. A fashionable cure for a fashionable illness. Lady Agatha uncorked the bottle and poured a measure into a crystal glass, its scent rising sweet and floral, betraying nothing of the sedative power contained within. She pressed it into Eleanor's hands. "Drink, darling. You'll feel like yourself again." Like herself. That was the cruelest lie. Before the tonic, Eleanor had been vibrant, curious, musical, full of quiet opinions she shared only with her governess. She sketched landscapes in the garden, read novels in her window seat, and laughed easily. But after her 18th birthday, society declared such brightness unbecoming. A young lady must be gentle, reserved, delicate as lace. When Eleanor did not conform to that ideal quickly enough, her mother declared her nervous, and the doctor agreed with disturbing eagerness. The tonic silenced her too well. Eleanor brought the glass to her lips. Her hands shook. The first sip was always the most difficult, a betrayal of herself. But the sweetness slid across her tongue, and the warmth bloomed through her chest like a spreading blush. Her muscles softened, her breath slowed. The uneasy heaviness in her thoughts lifted, replaced by floating calm. Lady Agatha watched with satisfaction. "You see? Better already." Eleanor's vision blurred slightly at the edges, colours blending like water over paint. The room softened. Her mother's sternness softened. Even her own despair softened into something muted, distant, unreachable. This, the doctor called a cure. This, society praised as repose. This, her mother believed, was salvation. "Good girl," Lady Agatha murmured, smoothing Eleanor's hair. "We'll have you presentable again in no time." Eleanor wanted to protest, to say she did not want to be presentable but real. But the words drifted away before they reached her lips, smothered beneath the tonic's falsified peace. She leaned back against the chaise, her limbs heavy, her thoughts slow. Through the misted window, the rain still fell in soft sheets, but she felt no desire to sketch it, no spark of inspiration. Only a dullness that felt like surrender. Lady Agatha stood, satisfied. "I'll send for another bottle tomorrow. We mustn't let the sadness return." She left the room with graceful certainty. Eleanor remained, staring at the rain, her expression serene, her pulse quiet, her spirit slipping inch by inch beneath the surface. In the fire's glow, the glass bottle shimmered like a holy relic. A cure, they called it. But Eleanor understood the truth. Victorian society did not heal its daughters. It subdued them sweetly, beautifully, lethally, until their voices were as faint as their hunger, and their dreams dissolved in cordial and powder, and the cure became the cage. Madame Celeste's dressmaking shop on Brookfield Row was a temple of silk and whispers. From the street it looked modest, a neat stone facade with lace curtains, but inside, society's most delicate ambitions were stitched into existence. Bolts of fabric lined the walls in shimmering towers. French satin, Italian velvet, gossamer tulle pale as morning frost. The air smelled faintly of starch, lavender, and the quiet panic of women desperate to remain desirable. Madame Celeste herself was a small woman with sharp eyes and nimble fingers, her hair pinned with ruthless precision. She measured and cut fabric with the steady grace of a surgeon, and indeed, many ladies treated her as one. For in London's highest circles, a dressmaker was not merely a craftswoman, she was a keeper of secrets. And Celeste kept more than most. On this cold morning, she stood at her measuring table, carefully smoothing a bolt of ivory silk when the shop bell tinkled. Lady Seraphina Wycliffe swept inside, wrapped in a plum-coloured cloak trimmed with sable, elegant, regal, and trembling faintly beneath the fur. "Madame Celeste," she breathed, attempting a smile. "I've come for the final fitting." "But of course," Celeste replied, her French accent softening the words. "This way, my lady." She guided Seraphina behind a silk screen where a mannequin waited draped in pale blue satin, the gown meant for the Duchess's winter gala. It was exquisite, embroidered with silver vines, the bodice cut to emphasize Seraphina's famously slender waist. "Exquisite," Seraphina whispered, running trembling fingers over the embroidery. almost too lovely for me." "Never that," Celeste said. "Now let us see how it fits." Serafina stepped behind the screen, where the maid unfastened her cloak, revealing a figure so narrow it seemed she had been carved down to the thinnest possibility of human form. Her corset, laced viciously tight, heaved with each breath. Her arms were like fragile reeds. Her collarbones stood sharp as sculpture. Celeste noticed. She always noticed. She had watched this decline for months. The fittings were once effortless, Serafina laughing, talking of balls and admirers. But as the coca powders became commonplace among her circle, Serafina arrived pale, distracted, jittery. The laudanum she used to sleep left her dim and slow. Her waist shrank. Her gowns needed constant taking in. And whenever Celeste touched her to lift a sleeve or adjust a seam, Serafina flinched with a sensitivity that suggested her nerves were unraveling thread by thread. Still, she smiled through it all. "Shall we begin?" Celeste asked gently. Serafina nodded, though her lips trembled as she stepped into the gown. The maid fastened the hooks, tightening the bodice with careful pulls. Serafina swayed slightly. "Careful," Celeste murmured, steadying her. "You are light on your feet today." Serafina chuckled weakly. "I haven't eaten since yesterday's luncheon. I must look perfect for the Duchess." Celeste's expression tightened, though she kept her voice level. One must have strength to wear her beauty well. "Oh, I have strength," Serafina insisted, though her voice quivered. "The tonic gives me all I need." Celeste had heard this before. Coca tonics were everywhere, disguised in elegant bottles, sold as nervous restoratives. Serafina's friends sipped them as casually as tea, and Celeste had watched each woman shrink beneath their lace gowns. She adjusted the gown's waist, her fingers brushing Serafina's ribs, too prominent, too fragile. "Hold still, please." Serafina tried, but her hands shook. The gown fit perfectly, but the woman inside it seemed close to breaking. Celeste stepped back. "You look stunning, my lady. But tell me truthfully, does the dress feel comfortable?" Serafina hesitated. A strange flicker moved across her hollowed face. "It feels tighter than I remember." "Because you are smaller than you remember," Celeste thought but did not say. Instead, she gestured for Serafina to walk. The young lady took 2 steps, then stopped abruptly, pressing a hand to her temple as though steadying a spinning world. "Perhaps I should sit," she whispered. Celeste guided her to a velvet chair. Serafina's breath came shallow and sharp, her corset straining with each pull. "My lady," Celeste said softly, kneeling to meet her eyes, "your health is more precious than your waist." Serafina blinked, surprised, almost frightened by the idea. "But what would they say if I lost my figure?" "They would say nothing worth hearing," Celeste replied. But Serafina shook her head. "No, they reward thinness, they praise it, they expect it." Celeste rose slowly, her heart heavy. She had measured dozens of women like Serafina. She had watched them shrink, and she had learned that society loved a woman best when she was fading. As Serafina stood again, pale but determined, Celeste knew the truth with chilling clarity. She was not tailoring gowns anymore. She was tailoring disappearances stitch by stitch, seam by seam, inch by inch. And Victorian London applauded every lost measure. The Harcourt townhouse on Belgrave Square exuded every sign of prosperity. A polished brass knocker, immaculate hedges trimmed as crisply as a regiment's parade line, and windows so spotless they reflected the street lamps like captured stars. Inside, footmen moved with disciplined quiet, and the drawing-room glowed with the warm amber sheen of carefully tended luxury. Yet within this refined household, a silence deeper than courtesy had begun to take root, a silence built on avoidance, denial, and the quiet unravelling of Mrs. Adelaide Harcourt. Adelaide sat before the fireplace, hands folded in her lap, her gown of pale lilac silk clinging too loosely to her shrinking frame. She had once been known for her lively charm and soft beauty, the sort of warmth that illuminated a room without effort. But now her cheeks bore faint hollows, her wrists looked as fragile as porcelain stems, and her smile, when it appeared, flickered rather than glowed. Her husband, Mr. Jonathan Harcourt, entered with the quiet authority of a man confident in his place in the world. He carried the faint scent of tobacco and the crispness of starched linen, his manner polished, composed, and entirely untroubled. "Adelaide," he said gently, "you missed supper again." She looked up, startled, brushing a stray curl behind her ear. "I wasn't hungry." "You never are." The words were spoken lightly, as though they meant nothing. Adelaide shifted in her chair, feeling the tremor in her fingers begin again, the after-effect of the coca tonic she had taken hours earlier, its brightness fading into nervous fluttering. "You know I prefer lighter meals," she murmured. Jonathan moved to pour himself a brandy. "So, you say—" His voice held no accusation, no concern, not even curiosity. It was simply a statement, as unaffected as if he were noting the weather. He swirled the amber liquid in his glass, watching the firelight catch the rim. "You look very well, though," he added, glancing at her with a half-smile. "Quite fashionable. The ladies at dinner spoke of your figure with envy." Adelaide lowered her eyes. "Did they?" "Oh, yes. Mrs. Compton, for one, remarked that you look more delicate each week. I believe the word she used was exquisitely refined." A cold shiver rippled through Adelaide's spine. That word refined had followed her for months, whispered behind fans, murmured at salons, uttered like a blessing. It was meant as praise. It felt like a verdict. Jonathan raised his glass. "You should be pleased. Society admires such elegance." She forced a smile. "Of course." But inside, her heart knocked wildly against her ribs, desperate to be heard. She had tried to tell him once, weeks ago, by the window overlooking the garden, that she felt unsteady, that her appetite had vanished, that her hands trembled even when she slept. He had listened with polite patience, then kissed her forehead and said, "You worry too much, my dear. A slender figure is a gift. A gift. A mask. A slow disappearance." Tonight, as they sat across from each other in the quiet of their well-appointed drawing-room, Jonathan poured himself another brandy but did not offer her one. He did not notice how she curled her fingers beneath her skirts to hide their shaking. He did not see the faint bluish tint beneath her eyes. He did not ask why her breath seemed shallow beneath the stays of her corset. He noticed only what he wished to see: elegance, obedience, refinement. Adelaide rose slowly, steadying herself against the arm of the chair as a wave of light-headedness swept over her. "I think I shall retire." "So early?" Jonathan asked mildly. "I'm very tired." He nodded, already turning back to the fire, already slipping back into the comfort of willful ignorance. "Rest well, my love." The words reached her ears like distant echoes. She ascended the staircase with careful, quiet steps, the walls seeming to tilt slightly around her. In her dressing room, the little bottle of coca tonic gleamed on her vanity like a waiting promise. She pressed both hands against the cool marble surface, her breath shaking. Her husband pretended not to notice. Society insisted she appear lovely. The mirror reflected her vanishing. And Adelaide Harcourt praised, admired, applauded, felt herself thinning in ways no gown maker could measure, fading beneath the weight of expectations no one dared speak aloud. The silence in the house deepened. It was the silence of a woman disappearing while the world praised her for it. The parlour of Mrs. Henrietta Blythe's townhouse was a hive of hushed chatter and clinking china, a room whose very walls seemed to listen. Floral wallpaper in shades of faded rose framed the gathering, while a great ormolu clock ticked solemnly above the mantelpiece, marking each minute with the deliberate patience of Victorian propriety. The air shimmered with perfume and sugar dust, but beneath it lingered something sharper, the acrid scent of whispered judgment. On this Tuesday afternoon, the parlour was crowded with ladies who had come to drink tea, exchange pleasantries, and dissect the lives of those absent. But their conversation had narrowed, almost hungrily, toward one subject: the mysterious frailties of London's most admired women. Mrs. Blythe, stout and resplendent in purple bombazine, leaned forward conspiratorially. "Have you noticed the Langford girl?" she murmured, eyes bright with intrigue. "Positively wasting away, poor thing. One would think she lives on air." A chorus of sympathetic sighs followed, sympathetic in tone, but delighted in texture. Lady Davenport dabbed at her lips with a lace handkerchief, her expression grave. It must be her nerves. These young ladies are so delicate. Their constitutions are simply not built for the demands of society. Several heads nodded. "Oh yes, nerves," someone echoed. "It's always nerves." But Mrs. Whitlow, thin as a reed and twice as sharp, interjected with a sly smile. "I heard she takes one of those fashionable tonics, the kind that quiets the appetite. Very popular, you know." The room fell briefly silent, not from shock, but from recognition. Every woman there understood exactly what she meant. Seated near the window was Miss Emmeline Carter, younger than the rest, her gloved hands clasped tightly in her lap. She had been invited as an act of courtesy, her family newly wealthy, her reputation as yet unblemished. She listened quietly, her cheeks warming as the ladies spoke, for she recognized herself in every whispered word. She, too, had begun taking the tonic. She, too, had grown pale, fragile, and fashionably thin. Mrs. Blythe lowered her voice further, though it still carried across the entire room. "The irony is this society demands their delicacy, yet condemns them when they achieve it." "Achieve?" Lady Davenport let out a brittle laugh. "My dear, they drug themselves for it." Emmeline's heart stuttered in her chest. Mrs. Whitlow sipped her tea, pretending innocence. "Not drugged," supplemented. "These remedies are perfectly respectable. My own physician recommends one for my digestion. A small dose of coca restores the spirits exquisitely." She said this with such serene self-assurance that even Emmeline felt a flutter of relief. Her tonic was not a vice, she told herself. It was refinement, administered in glass bottles with gilt labels. Yet, as the ladies leaned close, lowering their voices still further, the tone shifted from gossip to something darker, a collective diagnosis based not on science but on social appetite. "I fear these girls are too fragile," murmured Mrs. Blythe. "No strength, no appetite." "No will," added Lady Davenport. "No future," Mrs. Whitlow concluded softly. "No choice," Emmeline whispered under her breath. Unheard. The conversation swelled around her, the room growing warm, the edges of her vision blurring slightly. She had taken her morning tonic before arriving, just a half scoop, she thought, but the tremor in her hands betrayed the truth. Mrs. Whitlow noticed. Her sharp eyes narrowed with knowing calculation. "Emmeline, my dear," she purred, "you look pale. Are you unwell?" Every head turned. Emmeline straightened, forcing her breath to steady. I am perfectly fine. Only a touch light-headed." "A touch?" Mrs. Blythe gave a soft laugh, too kind to be kind. "How like our younger ladies, so slender, so delicate, so easily overwhelmed." The room hummed with agreement approval, disguised as concern. Emmeline lowered her gaze, her cheeks burning. She wanted to protest, to claim she was not fragile, not faint, not unraveling beneath lace gloves and polite society. But her voice caught in her throat as the tonic's subtle haze drifted through her mind. The parlour clock chimed the hour. The conversation shifted to balls, to dresses, to engagements yet unannounced. But Emmeline heard none of it. She sat quietly, hands trembling in her lap, while the women around her defined her illness without ever naming it. In Victorian London, Gossip diagnosed more accurately than physicians and far more cruelly. And for women like Emmeline, whose mirrors reflected fragility praised as beauty, the parlour became a place where the truth was dissected, but never spoken aloud. They were not delicate by nature. They were made so dosed, praised, and quietly undone. St. Bartholomew's glowed with wedding finery, garlands of white roses draped along the pews, candles flickering in tall brass holders, and sunlight streaming through stained glass windows in jewel-toned shards. It should have been a morning of celebration, the sort immortalized in family portraits and whispered about with fondness for decades. But beneath the splendor, a quiet tension threaded through the church like a drawn breath waiting to be released. Miss Cecilia Ashford stood in the narthex, veiled and trembling, her wedding gown of soft ivory satin clinging to a body so slender it seemed the fabric alone kept her upright. Her corset was laced too tightly. Her skin had taken on the faint translucence of porcelain held to the light. Even the bouquet in her hands, a cascade of orchids and stephanotis, felt too heavy. Behind her fussed her mother, fluttering like an anxious bird. "Darling, try to breathe. You look pale." Cecilia managed a faint smile. "It's only nerves." "Nerves are natural," her mother said briskly, though her eyes flickered with worry. "A single dose of your morning tonic would have calmed you beautifully. I told you to take it." "I did," Cecilia murmured. She did not add that she had taken two, or that her hands still trembled, or that the tonic, once so uplifting, now left her feeling hollow and tremulous, as though her bones were made of thin glass. The organ began its low, rolling prelude. Guests rose to their feet. The air thickened with perfume, anticipation, and the faint incense drifting from the altar. "It's time," her mother whispered. Cecilia took her father's arm and stepped into the aisle. The world swayed gently beneath her feet, not enough to stop her, but enough to remind her that she was moving through the scene like someone in a dream. Faces turned, smiles blossomed, fans fluttered, murmurs passed softly from pew to pew. Exquisite. So delicate. A vision. Those words had followed her for months as her figure shrank and her cheeks hollowed. People whispered admiration, not concern. Her fiancé, Lord Whitcomb, had even remarked with warmth meant as affection that she looked positively angelic these days. The tonic had helped her achieve that angelic appearance. It also kept her from sleeping, thinking clearly, or eating more than the smallest spoonfuls of broth. She took another step, and another. But the church seemed too warm, the candles too bright, her corset too tight. The scent of roses thickened around her like a shroud. Her pulse fluttered wildly, a bird trapped beneath her ribs. Halfway down the aisle, Cecilia's breath caught. The edges of her vision blurred into soft watercolor smears. The organ music grew distant, as though played from another room or another world. Her father's voice drifted toward her. "Cecilia, are you?" She never heard the rest. Her bouquet slipped from her hands. Orchids scattered like pale wings across the aisle. Cecilia's knees buckled, her body wilting gracefully, almost beautifully, toward the carpeted floor. Gasps erupted. Several ladies clutched their pearls. Others murmured pity in tones too sweet to be sincere. "Oh, the poor dear. She's too delicate." It must be her nerves. Her mother rushed forward, face drained of color. Lord Whitcomb hovered helplessly, torn between shock and propriety. The pastor, flustered, called for air to be made. The doors were flung open, and a cool gust swept through the sanctuary, stirring Cecilia's veil. She lay unconscious, serene as a fallen statue. The physician summoned from among the guests knelt beside her, taking her wrist. His brow tightened. "Her pulse is faint," he muttered. "Too faint. She's malnourished, and this scent." He lifted her gloved hand to his face, inhaling. Coca. Laudanum, too. Mixed. A murmur of scandal rippled through the pews. Her mother stiffened. Nonsense. She only takes what the doctor prescribes. The physician looked up sharply. Then the doctor is a fool. Cecilia stirred faintly, eyelids fluttering, her breath shallow. Lord Whitcomb knelt beside her, whispering her name with real fear at last, fear that had never surfaced while she grew ever thinner under his proud gaze. Cecilia, my love, can you hear me? Her lips parted, but no words emerged. The wedding could not continue. She was carried gently to the vestry, laid on a chaise, and revived slowly with salts and sips of broth, her first nourishment in days. Outside the closed doors, the guests whispered their diagnoses. Nerves, stress, over-excitement. But the truth seeped through the room like a shadow. She had not fainted from nerves. She had fainted from vanishing, from powders and tonics that hollowed her day by day. And though the wedding would be postponed, perhaps only briefly, the expectations would return the moment she could stand again. In Victorian London, even collapse was considered a delicate virtue. And a bride who fainted at the altar was not necessarily a warning, merely another tragic marvel of fashionable fragility. Morning in the Pembroke household arrived with the soft clatter of servants preparing trays, the muted sweep of brooms along polished floors, and the distant rumble of carriages passing through Kensington's quiet streets. In the dining room, sunlight filtered through lace curtains in delicate strips, illuminating the silverware with a cold, almost accusatory glint. Miss Josephine Pembroke sat at the long mahogany table, a single place setting arranged before her, with ritualistic precision porcelain plate, linen napkin, silver spoon, teacup filled with steaming Darjeeling. Beside the plate sat a dainty arrangement of soft-boiled egg, buttered toast, and a small dish of raspberry jam. A modest breakfast by any measure. Yet Josephine stared at it with the dread of a woman confronted with an impossible task. Her mother, Lady Helena Pembroke, sat at the opposite end of the table, upright and poised, her gown of dove-grey silk rustling faintly each time she moved. Her sharp gaze flicked toward her daughter, assessing, measuring, judging without a word. "Eat, Josephine," she said at last. "You are looking terribly pale." Josephine attempted a smile. "It's the light, Mama." "It's your habits," Lady Helena corrected, her tone crisp. "You barely touched your supper last night." "I wasn't hungry." "You are never hungry." The words hung in the air like the toll of a church bell, heavy, final. Josephine lowered her eyes, her stomach twisting not with hunger, but with the faint nausea that had plagued her for weeks. The coca tonic she took each morning to clear her mind, the doctor had said, had long since begun to silence any normal appetite she might have had. But Lady Helena did not know that, or pretended not to. "You must eat," her mother repeated. "A young woman cannot go about faint and frail. It is unbecoming." Unbecoming, the very opposite of the praise Josephine had heard from others. Such a graceful figure, so delicately built, quite the ideal silhouette. People admired her thinness the way they admired fine porcelain, fragile, untouchable, valuable, and Josephine, despite her private dread, had absorbed those words until they felt like truth. She lifted the spoon and attempted a bite of egg. Her hand trembled. The scent, faint but rich, made her throat tighten. She managed to swallow once, barely before the nausea surged. A faint sheen of sweat gathered at her temples. Her mother noticed. "Josephine, compose yourself." "I'm trying," she whispered. Lady Helena sighed with impatience, rising from her seat. She approached and placed a firm hand on Josephine's shoulder. "You must make an effort. No gentleman wishes to marry a girl too weak to walk through Hyde Park without collapsing." Josephine flinched inwardly, though her face remained composed. The pressure of expectation weighed on her like invisible hands tightening her corset. She forced another bite, chewed, swallowed, winced. Her mother folded her arms. "Better." But the moment she released her daughter's shoulder, Josephine's vision blurred. A cold wash swept over her. Her breath hitched. "Mama," she whispered. Before Lady Helena could reply, Josephine reached for her teacup and missed. The cup tipped, spilling hot tea across the tablecloth and onto her lap. She gasped softly, rising halfway from her chair before sinking back down, trembling. Footsteps thundered as servants rushed in. Lady Helena waved them off sharply. "Leave us," she commanded. "My daughter is merely overwrought." Overwrought, the fashionable excuse for everything from hunger to heartbreak to hidden addiction. When the room had cleared, Lady Helena knelt before Josephine, her expression shifting from irritation to fear she quickly attempted to mask. "Tell me the truth, child. What is happening to you?" Josephine's breath trembled. The room tilted slightly. I think something is wrong." "With your nerves?" Lady Helena asked. Josephine hesitated. "With your tonic? With your appetite? With the expectations that hollow you day by day?" But she only managed a single fragile word. "Yes." Lady Helena rose swiftly and reached for the bell pull. "Then Dr. Whitcomb will see you immediately." Josephine closed her eyes, her heart fluttering like a trapped bird. Another doctor, another bottle, another remedy, disguised as poison. She could not eat. She could not confess. She could only endure. As the servants prepared her carriage, Josephine stared at the untouched breakfast before her. Victorian society insisted she be delicate, but demanded she appear healthy. And in the quiet war between the two, she felt herself slipping spoonful by spoonful, sip by silent sip, into a life where even breakfast became an impossible burden. The Tremont household was unusually quiet for a Saturday afternoon. The clock in the hallway ticked with gentle insistence, its pendulum casting a slow golden arc across the wallpaper. From the drawing-room window, sunlight spilled in pale ribbons that illuminated floating dust motes, a peaceful scene that belied the dread tightening in Clara Tremont's chest as she stood outside her sister's bedroom door. She hesitated, hand hovering just above the polished brass handle. Inside, her younger sister Marianne had locked herself away again. Clara could hear faint rustling, a soft clink of glass against porcelain, and the uneven rhythm of footsteps pacing from one corner to the other. She knocked gently. "Marianne, it's Clara." Silence, then a pause, then the muffled edge of a trembling voice. I'm just resting." Clara opened the door anyway. Marianne stood by her vanity, pale as moonlight in her embroidered morning gown. Her hair hung loose, dark waves cascading over shoulders now startlingly narrow. She turned sharply when Clara entered, as though caught in something shameful, and in her hand, still uncorked, glimmered a small bottle of coca tonic. Clara's heart sank. "Again," she whispered. Marianne swallowed, lowering the vial onto the table with careful shaking fingers. "It helps. I just needed a little clarity." But Clara's eyes drifted to the reflection in the vanity mirror, and what she saw hollowed her. Marianne's face, once rosy and vibrant, wore a fragile stillness. Her cheekbones cast unfamiliar shadows. Her lips looked bloodless, her eyes too bright, too wide, as if perpetually startled by the world around her. Beneath her thin gown, Clara could see the faint curve of ribs, sharper each week. "You said you would stop," Clara murmured, stepping closer. "I said I would try," Marianne corrected softly, her gaze flickering downward. "But it's difficult. Everything feels so overwhelming without it." Clara reached out, grasping her sister's shaking hands. "You're disappearing." Marianne forced a laugh, but it broke mid-breath. "Everyone says I look radiant. Lord Marbury called me a living sculpture at the Wentworth ball. Because they don't see what I see." Marianne blinked rapidly. "What do you see?" Clara inhaled, gathering her courage. "A girl who can hardly climb the stairs. A girl whose corsets have been taken in 3 times this month. A girl who trembles even when she sleeps." Marianne flinched. Tears welled. "You make it sound monstrous." "No," Clara whispered. "Only tragic." The room grew still. The air was thick with rosewater and the sharper scent of the tonic sweet, metallic, chemical. Clara moved toward the vanity, her hand brushing the scattered objects there, a small silver spoon, a lace handkerchief stained faintly with powder, a half-empty laudanum bottle tucked behind a box of hairpins. "Marianne, both of these?" she asked quietly. Marianne did not answer. Her silence was confession enough. Clara turned to her, horror softening into grief. "You're mixing them. Coca to wake you, laudanum to bring you down." Marianne pressed trembling hands to her temples. "I can't sleep without it, and I can't function without the other. I don't know how to stop." Clara felt her throat tighten. She stepped forward, pulling Marianne gently into an embrace. Her sister's body felt weightless in her arms, her bones sharper than they should have been. "Let me help you," Clara urged. But Marianne shook her head, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. "Mama would never allow it. She thinks the tonic makes me presentable, and everyone praises me more now. I can't bear the thought of them seeing the real me again." "Better they see the real you," Clara said, "than lose you entirely." A fragile, painful silence followed. Through the window, a carriage rolled past, its wheels clattering faintly on the cobblestones, the sound of a world that admired beauty without understanding its cost. Marianne pulled away, wiping her tears. "Promise me something," she whispered. "Promise me you won't tell Mama. She'll send me to that dreadful physician who prescribes even stronger things." Clara hesitated, torn between loyalty and fear. I promise not to tell her today." Marianne closed her eyes, relief passing through her like a shiver. Clara stayed beside her for the rest of the afternoon, adjusting her blankets when she lay down, fanning her when dizziness overtook her, and quietly removing the bottles from her reach. She did not throw them away. Not yet, because she knew Marianne would simply find more. Instead, she placed them in her own room, where she could at least slow the spiral. As twilight descended, Clara looked at her sister's fragile, sleeping form and felt a cold, bitter truth settle over her. Victorian society praised a woman until she vanished, and then mourned her only when it was too late. Marianne was fading before her very eyes, and Clara was the only one who dared see it. Miss Eleanor Whitcomb sat at her writing desk, a small, polished piece of mahogany tucked into the corner of her bedroom, the morning sun streaming through lace curtains in pale, soft lines. Her quill hovered above the ivory page, trembling slightly despite the tonic still lingering in her veins. The ink pot, polished to a reflective shine, caught the light in tiny flecks glimmers of gold against the deep black liquid, and yet she could not write. The letters lay scattered across the desk, unopened, unsent. Each one bore the promise of confession, the faint hope that someone might understand, might see past the fragile, pale figure. Society applauded and recognized the girl who trembled inside, who was hollowed by powder, tonic, and expectation. The letters were addressed to friends, to family, to those who might speak words of caution, care, or restraint. But Eleanor knew better. The truth could not be entrusted to ink. One letter, neatly folded, bore the scrawled name of her governess. Another was intended for her mother, Lady Whitcomb, the architect of elegance and discipline, who had praised her daughter's slenderness while guiding it to a near vanishing. A third was addressed to a friend in Mayfair, a young woman who might have offered empathy had she known the true cost of being admired. Eleanor lifted the first letter and sighed, the movement stirring a faint dizziness. The words she had written bled from the quill in tentative, desperate lines. "I do not remember the last meal I ate. My hands tremble when I reach for tea. The tonic dulls my hunger, but it does not fill the hollowness beneath my ribs." She could not send it. The ink remained trapped between paper and quill as tightly as the fear trapped inside her chest. She pressed her fingers to her temples, blinking against the faint haze that had grown heavier since the morning dose. The coca tonic coursed through her system, lifting her energy and sharpening her focus, but it could not soothe the dread that whispered at the edges of consciousness, that society would never truly see the cost of their admiration, nor acknowledge the unraveling beneath her delicate frame. The letters, though unsent, had already served their purpose. Each one had allowed her to pour her anxieties into something tangible, to give shape to her tremors, her sleepless nights, her hollowed cheeks. Yet each one remained an artifact of unfulfilled relief, an echo of confessions never voiced, a testament to the isolation imposed by expectation and refinement. A soft knock came at the door. Eleanor's maid, Anna, appeared, gloves in hand. "Miss Eleanor, tea is ready," she said quietly. Her eyes flickered toward the desk, lingering on the scattered letters. Eleanor smiled faintly. "Thank you, Anna. Perhaps later." The girl nodded and withdrew, leaving Eleanor alone with her thoughts. She leaned back in her chair, the sun warming her pale shoulders, and considered the letters once more. Each contained fragments of her life, the tremors, the hunger, the doses of tonic and laudanum that sustained her while hollowing her from within. They were letters written in shadow, letters written in secrecy, letters written for a world that would never read them. Eleanor reached for the half-empty vial of coca tonic, letting her fingers brush the cool glass. She had taken her morning dose already, yet the faintest tremor persisted in her hands. A sip would steady, it would allow her to appear calm at luncheon, to glide through polite conversation, to maintain the fragile image society required. She closed her eyes for a moment, imagining the letters safely tucked away in a drawer. Never discovered, never read, never condemned. The tonic shimmered faintly in her mind's eye, a promise of composure. In Victorian London, a woman could pour her soul onto paper, could craft confessions, pleas, and truths, and yet remain utterly invisible. Eleanor opened her eyes, setting the quill down with quiet determination. The letters would remain unsent. The truth would remain contained. And she would drink the tonic again, just enough to face the world with the elegance expected, hollow and trembling as she might be beneath the lace, the corset, and the admiration of all who watched. The letters never sent were perhaps the truest testament of all, the silent acknowledgement of a life disappearing while the world applauded. The drawing-room of Lady Selina Havisham's Mayfair home was bathed in a light so pale it seemed almost unreal, slipping through the tall windows in thin shafts that illuminated dust motes, dancing like spectral attendants. The curtains, heavy with damask and gold trim, were drawn partially closed, as they always were, softening the glare of the noon sun and keeping the heat from settling too harshly upon the polished floors. In the dimmed room, society's expectations of restraint and refinement found a quiet, secret home. Lady Selina herself reclined upon a chaise longue, her form almost entirely consumed by silk cushions. Her waist, cinched impossibly tight, curved beneath the bodice of her gown, the pale cream fabric smoothing over bones that jutted more sharply than they should. Her fingers, delicate and trembling, clutched a porcelain teacup, though no liquid passed her lips. She had taken her morning dose of coca tonic, barely half the recommended amount, and yet the tremor persisted, betraying the fragile balance she maintained between composure and collapse. From the parlor beyond, the faint clatter of service echoed a distant reminder that the world continued outside her curtains. A maid, delicate and watchful, moved silently about the room, attending to tasks invisible to the lady herself. She adjusted a cushion, replaced a flower in its vase, and drew the folds of the curtain slightly tighter without a word. Her presence was unobtrusive, yet indispensable, a guardian of appearances. Selina's gaze lingered on the muted light, tracing the patterns it made across the floor, across the gilded frames of portraits, whose painted eyes seemed to follow her every motion. Each face, a matron, a child, a former beauty frozen in oil and canvas, stared with impartial scrutiny, as if silently judging the passage of time, the fragility of the flesh, the impermanence of youth. She felt a tremor in her chest, a flutter that no tonic could quite still. The curtains were drawn, deliberately, as they had been for years. Afternoon light could betray the true hue of her skin, the pallor of her cheeks beneath the powder. It could reveal the shadows that lurked beneath her eyes, the delicate hollows that marked her as frailer than the world was willing to notice. And so the curtains remained, a veil, a shield, a fragile boundary between the elegance required and the exhaustion endured. Her mind drifted, as it so often did at this hour, to the gatherings she would attend later in the day. Luncheons, teas, appointments with friends who never asked why she seemed so thin, so pale, so fragile. Each encounter demanded perfection, demanded poise, demanded a fragile performance that she had rehearsed 1,000 times before mirrors lined in gilded frames. The C0caine had granted her energy for these appearances, laudanum would grant her rest afterward, and in between, the curtains ensured that no one observed her as she teetered upon the edge of collapse. The world praised her for grace, delicacy, and composure, but no one applauded the hollow ache within her bones, the tremor in her fingers, the quiet exhaustion that spread beneath her ribcage. She sipped the faintest drop of tea, enough to wet her lips, and allowed her eyes to close. The room blurred into soft shadows, sunlight muted behind layers of velvet and lace. In that quiet, drawn curtain, she felt a strange solace, a temporary sanctuary where no one could see her fading, where the day's expectations were muted, and where the delicate woman society demanded she be could endure another hour, another moment, another glance, untouched by judgment. For in Victorian London, the curtains were more than decoration. They were a protection, a silence, a secret. And for Lady Selina Havisham, they were the only thing standing between the fragile illusion of perfection and the truth of her quiet unraveling. The morning sunlight was diffused through heavy velvet curtains, falling in muted stripes across the polished oak floors of Lady Arabella Cresswell's dressing chamber. The room smelled faintly of rosewater, powder, and the lingering sweetness of yesterday's tonic. Sunlight pooled across the antique rug, yet it illuminated more than the gilded furniture and delicate lace. It revealed the toll of months, perhaps years, spent bending body and spirit to the rigid standards of Victorian elegance. Arabella stood before her full-length mirror, the edges carved with intricate roses and vines. Its silvered surface gleamed faintly, capturing every nuance of the pale room. In it, she saw the carefully maintained reflection that society demanded. Smooth contours, delicate shoulders, luminous eyes, and the narrow waist praised by friends, family, and the unrelenting gossip of London's elite. Yet, for Arabella, the mirror betrayed more than it concealed. She leaned closer, her breath forming small clouds upon the glass. Every glance sharpened the lines in her face, accentuated the shadows beneath her eyes, and highlighted the hollows in her cheeks that powder could not fill. Her hands trembled slightly as she smoothed the folds of her gown, the satin clinging unnaturally to her narrowing frame. She was praised for this frailty, lauded for her delicate composure, yet each day she felt herself dissolve further, a ghost in silk and lace. Arabella's pulse was quickened by the morning dose of C0caine, a fleeting lift that gave her the illusion of energy and poise. But beneath it, her body shook, her stomach fluttered, and the lingering tremor in her fingers reminded her of the tonic's subtle cruelty. It gave form and grace while hollowing her from within. She reached for the vanity, lifting a small crystal bottle of laudanum cordial. Its amber liquid caught the light and seemed to pulse with a life of its own. The night's dose, she knew, would quiet her trembling limbs and allow sleep to claim her briefly. But tonight, as she stared into the mirror, sleep seemed distant, a luxury she could not yet afford. Her reflection stared back with unsettling clarity. The eyes were wide and luminous, but the spirit behind them was faint, almost entirely consumed by the expectations that had brought her to this form. The mirror did not lie, not entirely, but it reflected only what society wished to see: elegance, refinement, slenderness. The truth, the quiet unraveling, remained only in the trembling of her fingers, the faint blue of her lips, the hollow ache beneath her ribs. Arabella pressed her palms to the surface of the glass, as though she might steady herself against the reflection's sharp honesty. She remembered the whispers in the drawing rooms, the polite congratulations on her figure, the careful attention from gentlemen and matrons alike. None had ever asked how she maintained such refinement. None had considered what she had sacrificed: meals skipped, nights shortened, nerves stretched taut as the laces of her corset. A faint cough from the hallway reminded her of the household waiting beyond these walls, of the letters she would send later, unsent confessions of exhaustion, trembling, and fear. No one would read them. No one could understand the slow, relentless work of expectation and chemical intervention that had hollowed her so completely. She lifted the laudanum cordial to her lips, allowing a small sip to warm her throat. The mirror softened in the flickering light, the edges of the reflection blurring just enough to offer a reprieve. The tremors eased, though only momentarily. Arabella exhaled, leaning back against the chaise, eyes never leaving the glass. In that mirrored image, she saw both herself and the shadow that no one would acknowledge. Society admired the reflection, but she understood the truth. The mirror did not merely reflect beauty. It revealed the cost of being admired, the price of being delicate, the quiet, relentless theft of life from within. And as Arabella straightened, adjusting the folds of her gown for another day of appearances, she knew that the mirror would witness it all: her fragile poise, her fading strength, and the shadow that only she could truly see. The afternoon in Mayfair carried a quiet weight, the streets veiled in mist, and the distant clatter of horse-drawn carriages echoing softly against the polished stone facades. Inside the drawing-room of Lady Cecilia Ravenscroft, the air was fragrant with lavender and polished wood, but tinged with the sharper scent of secrecy, a subtle, almost imperceptible reminder that appearances here were more vital than reality. Cecilia sat near the window, her posture immaculate, her gloved hands resting on her lap, and her face partially obscured by a delicate black veil that had once been reserved for mourning. Now it was worn daily, indoors, and for reasons even her closest acquaintances could not guess. The veil hid the hollows beneath her eyes, the faint shadows across her cheeks, the sharpness of a jawline drawn taut by powder, corset, and tonic. It was her shield against scrutiny, the last barrier between the truth of her fragility and the expectations of a society that praised such delicacy. Her maid, Alice, hovered near the fireplace, fanning the coals with a soft, rhythmic motion. She had learned to move like a shadow, careful never to disturb the fragile poise of her mistress. Alice knew the veil's purpose, though she said nothing. Discretion was as essential as the powder that lay in its crystal bottles on the vanity. Cecilia lifted her gloved hands to adjust the edge of the veil, smoothing it over her face. The touch was almost ritualistic, a daily gesture that reminded her of the performance she maintained at all times. Graceful, composed, ethereal, she could not allow even the smallest tremor to betray the hours of weakness, the nights spent awake with her pulse racing, the mornings where the coca tonic had sharpened her senses while hollowing her from within. Outside, the sunlight pressed against the glass, softening the outlines of the garden. But indoors, the veil created its own twilight. It was comforting, like a shadow she could inhabit, like a secret she could carry without consequence. The mirror across the room reflected her still, pale figure, but the veil softened the harshness of that reflection. She appeared composed, elegant, proper. She was the image society required, though the body beneath quivered faintly with the echoes of the night's restless sleep. Cecilia's mind drifted to the coming social engagements, luncheons, teas, and afternoon calls, where she would be scrutinized by the ladies of the ton. Her figure would be admired, her posture praised, her composure noted. No one would ask how she maintained it. No one would see the trembling fingers beneath the gloves, the ache beneath her ribs, the faint hollows beneath her eyes. Only the veil could conceal all of that. A soft knock at the door announced the arrival of a visiting acquaintance. Cecilia straightened immediately, her hand brushing the veil to ensure it was perfectly positioned. The visitor entered, greeted her warmly, and spoke of trivialities, the weather, a new gown, the latest ball. Cecilia replied with practiced ease, her voice steady, her hands still, her movements flawless. Beneath the veil, though, her breath came in careful, measured pulls, her pulse lifted with a quiet urgency that she alone felt. After the visitor left, Cecilia allowed herself a faint sigh, leaning back in her chair. The veil remained in place, its black fabric a protective shadow. She touched the small vial of coca tonic on the table, feeling the familiar comfort of its weight, knowing it would restore her composure later, when she needed it most. In Victorian London, appearance was everything. A pale, delicate, trembling woman was applauded, admired, and envied. The veil was her armor, her refuge, her silent accomplice in the grand illusion. Beneath it, Cecilia's body was fragile, her mind restless, and her spirit quietly hollowed. Yet, as she adjusted the veil once more and gazed into the softened reflection of the mirror, she understood. In this society, a woman's secrets were best carried beneath black silk, unseen, untouchable, and uninterrupted, a hidden truth behind an admired, delicate facade. The boudoir of Lady Beatrice Montague was a small room of restrained elegance, filled with the soft scent of roses, lavender, and a trace of ambergris lingering in the morning light. Perfume bottles gleamed along the vanity, each one a delicate vessel of fragrance, pale glass etched with filigree, slender necks topped with crystal stoppers. They were admired for their beauty, collected for display, and handled with reverence. Yet among them, hidden behind the innocuous jars of scent, lay a darker truth. Bottles of tonic and cordial, the secret elixirs upon which her delicate composure depended. Beatrice stood before the vanity, adjusting her hair with slow, precise movements, her eyes flicking toward the array of perfume. It was a tableau of refinement, yet she knew what hid behind the glimmering glass. A small cobalt bottle, its label tucked behind a jar of violet-scented eau de toilette, contained the morning dose of coca tonic, a liquid that steadied her pulse and sharpened her senses. Beside it, a tiny crystal vial of laudanum awaited, a quiet promise for the night, softening her trembling limbs and lulling her toward a fragile, artificial rest. Her gloved hands lingered over the perfume bottles, tracing their curves, appreciating their beauty, while simultaneously noting the weight and presence of the hidden bottles behind them. The act was both comforting and suffocating, a daily ritual of concealment and acknowledgement, of dependence cloaked in elegance. Beatrice poured a small measure of the tonic into a delicate silver spoon, inhaling its faintly sweet scent before tipping it beneath her tongue. The effect was immediate, a subtle bloom of warmth, a quieting of her nerves, a temporary stilling of the tremors that ran like hidden currents beneath her skin. Her pulse steadied, her shoulders relaxed. The reflection in the mirror brightened, her eyes catching the light with a clarity she could not achieve naturally. The bottles had been her companions for weeks, months, perhaps longer. They had been entrusted to her by physicians who spoke with soft smiles, recommending the doses with a combination of authority and indulgence. They had been purchased discreetly from chemists who smiled knowingly, who never asked questions, and whose shelves held the same tonics for every woman, striving to maintain the fragile perfection society demanded. Beatrice's gaze drifted to the mirror. Her reflection was flawless, pale, slender, elegant. She looked as though she floated, untroubled by gravity or worry. Yet she knew the truth. Each inch lost beneath her corset, each hollowed cheek, each tremor suppressed by powder or liquid, was paid for in secrecy and private suffering. The bottles hid more than medicine. They hid the cost of her beauty, the fragility beneath her silken exterior. Her maid, Lillian, entered quietly, carrying a tray of tea. Beatrice nodded without speaking, still caught in the contemplation of the hidden elixirs. Lillian paused, casting a discreet glance at the bottles. She did not comment. She had learned long ago that discretion was the currency of service, and in the homes of London's elite, secrets were rarely spoken aloud. Beatrice set the silver spoon down and adjusted her gown, smoothing the silk across her narrowing hips. She drew a deep breath through the veil of perfume that masked the tonic scent, the weight of secrecy pressing gently upon her chest. Outside, the morning sun illuminated the city with impartial brilliance. Inside, she remained suspended between reality and artifice. Her beauty, maintained by hidden liquids and careful deception. The bottles remained behind the perfume, hidden, silent, patient, waiting to restore the fragile illusion, to smooth the tremors, to steady the hands and mind of a woman admired for every ounce of delicacy, and condemned by none who could see the truth beneath the surface. In Victorian London, elegance was a performance, and the bottles hidden behind perfume were the props without which the performance could not continue. The evening fog crept through the streets of London, curling around lampposts and cobblestones, drifting into alleys and across the silent, gaslit squares. It pressed against windows with a cold insistence, as though searching for the truths hidden behind shutters and drawn curtains. Within one such house, high on Grosvenor Square, the room was quiet save for the soft crackle of a dying fire and the faint clink of glass on polished wood. Lady Arabella Sinclair sat alone at her dressing table, a solitary figure framed in the soft glow of candlelight. Before her lay the tools of her existence, a crystal vial of coca tonic, half empty and glimmering faintly, a small bottle of laudanum, carefully corked, powder puffs, lace gloves, and the veil she wore over her face each afternoon to hide the shadows beneath her eyes. These objects, so innocuous to the untrained eye, had become the anchors of her life, the silent accomplices in the maintenance of fragile perfection. Arabella's hands, slender and trembling, hovered over the tonic. She did not yet reach for it. Instead, she gazed into the mirror, studying the reflection that had become both her shield and her prison. Her cheeks were hollow, her collarbones sharply defined, her eyes luminous with the faintest unnatural brightness, the effect of powders and secret doses carefully measured. To any visitor, she would appear delicate, radiant, composed, admirable, perfect. Yet she knew the truth. The mirror did not lie entirely, but it did not speak. It concealed the toll taken beneath the silk and satin, the hidden hours spent trembling in darkness, the nights of restless vigils in which tonic and laudanum competed for control over her pulse. The mirror preserved the image society required, beauty distilled into a pale, ethereal figure, weightless and obedient. But it could not hide the shadow that lingered at the edges of her consciousness, the shadow that whispered of bones hollowed by corsets, of hunger silenced by powder, of life diminished by expectation. Arabella inhaled slowly, the faint scent of rosewater and the lingering sweetness of laudanum curling around her senses. She thought of her peers, all equally hollowed and equally admired. The ton praised them for their refinement, their grace, their delicate composure, oblivious to the chemical assistance that kept them upright, oblivious to the quiet, creeping erosion of vitality beneath the surface. She remembered the letters she had once begun, only to leave them unsent, the diaries she had torn pages from, the secret notes she had written for herself, hidden beneath velvet and lace. They were fragments of truth that no one would ever read, proof that the women of her society had lived lives of silent compromise, of hidden torment, of beauty purchased at the price of their own well-being. A faint wind rattled the window pane. Arabella reached for the tonic at last, tipping a small measure beneath her tongue. The warmth spread quickly, steadying her trembling hands, softening the flutter of her pulse. The mirror reflected the restored elegance, the smooth lines, the luminous eyes. The shadow of exhaustion faded just enough to maintain the illusion. She allowed herself a brief, fragile smile. Society would continue to admire her. Society would continue to demand delicacy. And the secret would survive hidden behind lace, behind veils, behind carefully measured sips of tonic and drops of laudanum. It would endure long after her own life had passed, whispered only in the silent understanding of those who had once shared it, or caught it in a glance behind drawn curtains. Arabella placed the vial back in its hiding place, behind perfume bottles that gleamed innocently in the candlelight. She drew the veil across her face, masking the faint shadows that remained, and rose from the dressing table. The world outside would never know, nor would it ever understand. In Victorian London, elegance endured, fragility was admired, and the cost, the trembling hands, hollowed cheeks, silenced appetites, was a secret that survived the century. Behind every flawless gown, every admired posture, every delicate smile, the shadow lingered. The shadow of women, hidden by their own society, and by the remedies that sustained them. The shadow survived, and it would not be spoken aloud. The morning light fell in soft, hesitant streams through the narrow windows of Lady Margaret Ashcombe's dressing chamber, illuminating the familiar tableau of porcelain, lace, and polished wood. The room smelled faintly of rosewater, lavender, and a subtle sweetness that lingered from the tonic she had taken hours before. Along the vanity, rows of delicate perfume bottles caught the light, their crystal stoppers glittering like captured dew. To an observer, the display spoke of refinement, taste, and leisure. Yet behind the glimmering facades lay hidden bottles, small vials of coca tonic and laudanum cordial, the tools that sustained her composure while hollowing her from within. Lady Margaret lifted her gloved hands to adjust her hair, careful not to disturb the illusion of perfection. Her pulse fluttered faintly, a subtle tremor, barely masked by the tonic's lingering effects. The reflection in the mirror was everything society demanded: pale, luminous, slender, and poised. But beneath the silk and powder, she felt the quiet erosion of her strength, the lingering emptiness that came from suppressed hunger and sleepless nights. The bottles behind the perfume offered the only relief, the only means of maintaining the fragile performance required of her. She reached for the smallest vial, a cobalt blue glass bottle tucked behind a delicate eau de toilette. The tonic shimmered faintly in the morning light, a promise of steadiness and energy. A drop on her tongue eased the tremor in her fingers, dulled the ache in her stomach, and sharpened her thoughts enough to navigate the afternoon's obligations. But the relief was temporary, a fleeting bloom of calm over the hollowness beneath her ribs. Every morning, the ritual repeated: adjust the gown, smooth the hair, dab the powder, take the tonic, and hide the bottle behind perfume, where it could not be discovered. The world praised her for elegance, for refinement, for fragility. No one questioned the effort, the chemicals, the hollow ache that sustained her every gesture. The bottles remained silent accomplices, waiting patiently on the vanity, offering composure at a cost that no one would name aloud. Her maid, Clara, moved quietly through the room, arranging brushes and folding gloves, her eyes flickering toward the hidden bottles with a mixture of understanding and fear. Clara had witnessed the slow unraveling of her mistress for months, the trembling hands, the faint, pale lips, the restless nights. She had learned long ago that discretion was paramount. To speak of these bottles would be to invite scandal, punishment, or both. Lady Margaret's eyes lingered on her reflection. The mirror was merciless in its honesty, yet the veil of powder, the tight corset, and the carefully measured sip of tonic transformed the reality into perfection. The image she presented to the world was immaculate, luminous, enviable. Yet she knew the truth beneath, a fragile figure sustained by chemicals, carefully concealed behind perfume, admired for the very delicacy that threatened to undo her. The morning bell rang faintly from the street below, reminding her of the luncheon to which she would go, where the same performance would be demanded. She inhaled deeply, smoothed the lace at her wrists, and tucked the cobalt vial safely behind the larger, glimmering perfume bottle. The secret was preserved, the illusion remained. In Victorian London, elegance was a currency, and the bottles hidden behind perfume were its quiet, indispensable coin. They preserved the illusion, masked the tremor, and allowed the performance of fragility to continue uninterrupted. Yet Lady Margaret knew that each sip, each careful concealment, brought her closer to the shadow she could never show the world, a shadow admired, praised, and quietly obliterated behind lace, silk, and the glimmering glass of perfume bottles. The drawing room at Lady Evelyn Chalmers' townhouse was arranged with a meticulous eye, every chair aligned, every vase of flowers freshly watered, and the hearth casting a gentle amber glow across the polished floorboards. The air was thick with the faint aroma of rosewater and beeswax, but beneath it lingered the sharper, bittersweet scent of secrecy and unspoken truths. It was in this room, beneath the illusion of civility, that Miss Catherine Langley, friend, confidant, and witness, arrived one late afternoon, too late to intervene, too late to prevent the slow, quiet unraveling of her dearest companion. Eleanor Whitcomb, draped in her pale lilac gown, reclined against the chaise longue by the window, her posture flawless, her eyes luminous with the faint, unnatural brightness left by the morning's tonic. Her gloved hands rested lightly in her lap, but a tremor betrayed the fragility beneath the silk. Catherine had arrived with the intention of a cheerful visit to offer sympathy, support, or perhaps gentle counsel, but upon seeing Eleanor, the words froze on her tongue. "Eleanor," she whispered, stepping closer. Her friend turned, offering a smile carefully measured to appear serene, composure maintained through force of habit and habit alone. Yet Catherine could see it, the hollowing beneath her cheeks, the shadows lining her eyes, the subtle quiver in her delicate fingers. She had been too late to see the gradual erosion, to intervene before the powder, the tonic, and the relentless expectation had taken their toll. Eleanor's smile faltered slightly, a flicker of fatigue hidden beneath the veil of civility. "Catherine, you startled me," she murmured. "It has been a long morning." Catherine drew a breath, steadying herself. "I should say so. You look quite fragile, Eleanor. Are you feeling well?" The question hung in the air, heavier than the delicate scent of roses. Eleanor's eyes flickered toward the corner of the room, where a small cobalt vial gleamed faintly behind a row of perfume bottles, on the vanity her morning dose of tonic, her lifeline, her silent accomplice. She lowered her gaze once more, smoothing her gown, as if it could smooth away the truth Catherine was beginning to perceive. I am quite well," Eleanor said, voice controlled, though Catherine could detect the faintest tremor beneath the words. "Only a touch weary." Catherine approached and seated herself with measured care. She had watched Eleanor for weeks, at luncheons, at teas, and during the brief walks where she appeared radiant, admired, and enviable. But now, in the quiet intimacy of the drawing room, Catherine could see the reality the world had never acknowledged. Eleanor's vitality had been quietly siphoned away by expectation, by tonic, by laudanum. Her beauty remained intact, applauded, admired, but it was a beauty sustained by careful concealment, by chemical aid, by the tireless labor of endurance. "Eleanor," Catherine said softly, her voice trembling with concern, I wish I had noticed sooner. Perhaps I could have helped you. This cannot be right." Eleanor's hands twitched beneath her gloves, a small, involuntary gesture that betrayed the exhaustion she fought to hide. "You could not have known," she murmured, voice tight. "No one could, and even if you had, what could be done?" Catherine pressed her hand gently against Eleanor's, a fleeting touch that offered warmth and solidarity. "Perhaps something could have been done," she said, almost to herself. Before it went this far. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly, letting the warmth of Catherine's hand reach her, even as the tonic pulsed faintly beneath her ribs, steadying her outward composure while the body beneath remained fragile. They sat in silence, two friends caught between reality and illusion, between the fragile performance demanded by society and the quiet truth of a life quietly eroding. Outside, London's streets hummed with activity, oblivious to the secret unraveling within the drawing room. Catherine's heart ached as she realized what had been lost weeks, perhaps months, of slow diminishment that no smile, no gown, no veil could conceal. She had arrived too late, and Eleanor, admired and praised by all, remained trapped in the careful, lonely performance that had already begun to claim her from the inside. In Victorian London, the world applauded delicacy, ignored suffering, and rarely noticed until it was far too late. Catherine understood now that friendship, though heartfelt, could not always intervene against expectation, against chemical dependence, against society itself. And as she watched Eleanor adjust her veil, hiding the faint shadows beneath her eyes, Catherine felt the silent weight of a truth that would remain unspoken for generations. Some secrets survived the century quiet, unacknowledged and utterly unavoidable. The house on Grosvenor Square was unnaturally still, the kind of quiet that pressed against the walls and the floors and even the heavy velvet drapes, as if the building itself held its breath. Lady Marianne Ellsworth lay upon the fainting couch in the drawing-room, her gown of pale cream silk pooling around her like spilled light. Her hands rested limply upon the cushions, the fingers pale, trembling faintly even beneath the protective veil of gloves. The faint scent of laudanum lingered in the air, soft and sweet, masking the harsher tang of fatigue and tonic. The knock at the door was gentle, almost polite, yet it carried the weight of inevitability. "Enter," Marianne whispered, her voice fragile, as though it might fracture entirely if spoken any louder. Dr. Reginald Whitcomb stepped inside, tall, sombre, and precise in his movements. His coat brushed against the rug with the soft sound of a distant wind. He carried his black case, polished and deliberate, the tools of his trade resting within, though Marianne knew in her heart that the items he bore were merely instruments to preserve appearances, to sustain the fragile illusion that society demanded. "Good afternoon, Lady Marianne," he said softly, yet with a firm undertone. "How do you feel today?" Marianne shifted slightly, careful not to disturb the folds of her gown. I am as well as can be expected," she murmured. Her eyes flickered toward the small blue bottle on the nearby table, the morning tonic, which had already begun to course through her veins, steadying her trembling hands and sharpening her outward composure. Dr. Whitcomb approached and set his case upon the table. He withdrew a small notebook and began to scribble a few notes, though his eyes remained fixed upon her, sharp and unblinking. "Lady Marianne, we have discussed your regimen at length," he said, his voice low, measured, almost gentle. "I must be candid with you now. Your constitution has been pushed beyond its natural limits. The tonics, the elixirs, the powders, they have preserved your appearance, yes, but they have eroded your strength." Marianne's breath caught faintly beneath her veil. I did not realize," she whispered. "I thought I was careful." "You were careful," Dr. Whitcomb acknowledged. "But Victorian society is not forgiving to delicate constitutions. Your health, has been compromised by expectations, by performance, and by the very remedies that were meant to sustain you. It is time to consider a different course, a withdrawal, a period of rest, and careful nourishment. Marianne's lips trembled. But my appearances, the appearances, Lady Marianne, will survive without the tonic, he replied gently but firmly. It is the body that will not survive if the regimen continues. Her hands twitched beneath her gloves. She had measured her life by appearances for months, by the admiration of society, by the faint glances and whispered compliments of those who never knew the toll beneath the silks and powders. She had tried to obey the rules, to follow the prescriptions, to appear composed, graceful, delicate. Yet, in that moment, she realized that the performance had carried her too far. Dr. Whitcomb withdrew a small vial of gentle restorative, one meant to soothe the withdrawal from the stimulants she had relied upon. We must begin slowly, he said. Each step must be measured, or the body will rebel. And you must eat, Lady Marianne. Nourishment is now paramount. Your figure, your elegance, they will follow naturally once your body is permitted to sustain itself. Marianne swallowed, nodding faintly, though her pulse fluttered in anxious recognition of the slow, inevitable transformation that lay ahead. She had depended on the bottles for months for composure, for energy, for admiration, and yet the doctor's words reminded her that appearances were secondary to life itself. He closed his notebook and fixed her with a steady gaze. This is the final visit, Lady Marianne. From now on, we restore your health, not your image. The air in the room seemed to press closer, the candles flickering as though in anticipation. Marianne lowered her eyes, feeling the weight of the reality she had long denied. The tonic, the powders, the laudanum, all of it had preserved a reflection admired by society, but it had not preserved her. She exhaled slowly, allowing herself for the first time to consider the cost of beauty, the cost of refinement, and the quiet, merciless truth of Victorian expectations. The bottles, the powder, the tonic, they had controlled her. But at last, with Dr. Whitcomb's final visit, she would regain her own body and perhaps her own life. The room was small and dimly lit, with shadows stretching long across the walls, as if the night itself pressed against every corner. Outside, the fog clung to the streets of Mayfair, curling around gas lamps and creeping beneath doorways. Within Lady Marianne Ellsworth's bedroom, the world had shrunk to the space between her bed and the vanity, between the flickering candle and the faint glimmer of the glass bottles lined like sentinels upon the table. Marianne lay beneath a heavy quilt, yet her body was scarcely warmed. The tonic from the afternoon still pulsed faintly in her veins, sharpening her thoughts, steadying her hands. Yet it could not quell the creeping chill that began deep within her. She trembled, first in her fingers, then in her arms, her shoulders quivering beneath the weight of the corset she had not dared remove. The laudanum had dulled her mind, brought moments of sleep, but it could not shield her from the shivering that now took hold. It coursed up her spine in waves, leaving her breath short, her chest tight, her mind flickering between wakefulness and the dull fog of semi-consciousness. Every time she closed her eyes, the shadows of the room stretched longer, and the temperature of the night seemed to drop further, pressing icy fingers against her skin. She reached for the cobalt vial on the nightstand, her hand trembling as though the tonic it contained were both relief and punishment. The last few drops of the morning's dose had not sufficed. The body demanded more, though she feared each sip might betray her further. Her pulse raced as her fingers closed around the cool glass, and she tipped the liquid beneath her tongue, savoring the warmth that spread almost immediately, though it was fleeting. Marianne pulled the quilt tighter around her shoulders, curling inward as if she could shrink into herself and escape both the shivering and the vigilance required of her every waking moment. She remembered the day's luncheon, the tight corset, the polite compliments on her fragile elegance. She had smiled, nodded, accepted praise, yet each movement, each gesture, had been a performance, meticulously measured. The tonic and laudanum were not indulgences, they were instruments of survival, keeping her upright, keeping her admired, keeping the world from seeing the girl beneath the gown, trembling in exhaustion and fear. The candle flickered as the wind pressed against the window. Marianne's teeth chattered softly, the sound muted by the weight of the quilt. Her mind wandered, circling around the faces of her friends, her mother, the governess, who watched in quiet concern. They all admired her, but none had seen the truth. The body so praised was hollowed, the mind so admired was frayed, and the spirit beneath it all was shivering with the effort of maintaining appearances. She lay back against the pillow, letting the tonic pulse through her, but the chill did not fully dissipate. Her hands shook beneath the covers, her heartbeat fluttered in her ears, and her eyes, wide and luminous in the candlelight, betrayed the frailty no one else would acknowledge. Outside, the fog pressed closer, indifferent to the struggles within. Inside, Marianne clutched the quilt tighter, tasting both fear and the faint sweetness of the medicines that sustained her. She shivered endlessly, trapped between the demands of society, the expectations of her family, and the silent toll exacted by the tonics she relied upon. In Victorian London, elegance demanded fragility, and fragility required endurance. Yet the night offered no comfort, no reprieve, only the long, shivering hours through which the girls who were praised for their delicate beauty passed quietly, hidden behind quilts, veils, and the merciful blur of tonic and laudanum. The salon at Lady Beatrice Ashcroft's townhome hummed with the soft murmur of polite conversation, the delicate clink of porcelain cups, and the occasional rustle of silk gowns sweeping across polished floors. Outside, the afternoon sun slanted through tall windows, casting the room in golden light, yet inside, a shadow lingered, subtle but undeniable, as if the air itself carried the weight of expectation. Every word spoken, every glance exchanged, was carefully measured, and every whisper carried its own peril. Miss Eleanor Whitcomb sat near the window, her gloved hands folded delicately in her lap, the faint tremor beneath them disguised by the folds of her gown. Her eyes, wide and luminous, scanned the salon as if cataloguing every expression, every nuance. She had arrived early, as always, to ensure her composure was impeccable. The coca tonic had sharpened her pulse and quieted her hunger. Laudanum would see her through the evening, yet she remained acutely aware of the scrutiny that attended her every motion. The women gathered in small clusters, sipping tea and murmuring compliments. At first, the conversation seemed benign observations about the new dressmaker's designs, the latest charity events, the expected arrivals of distinguished guests. But slowly, inevitably, it shifted to the less tangible subjects, the subtle assessments that carried more weight than applause. Who had lost weight? Who seemed too pale? Who had faltered during the past week's assemblies? "Did you see Lady Margaret at luncheon yesterday?" whispered Mrs. Pembroke to her companion, a faint smile playing on her lips. She appeared positively ethereal, but so very fragile, I fear. "Fragile?" the companion echoed softly, lowering her voice further. "Yes, delicate, yes. But I hear she barely touches her meals. It must be the tonics and powders. Such a clever way to maintain elegance, yet so dangerous." Eleanor's pulse quickened. She recognized the words, the cadence, the judgments delivered under the veil of politeness. The salon, a place of refinement and fashion, was also a theatre of scrutiny, where whispered diagnoses carried as much authority as physicians' prescriptions. She sipped her tea, pretending to be absorbed in its delicate aroma, while her mind catalogued each subtle gesture, the tilt of a head, the careful spacing between words, the glint of judgment in eyes, otherwise softened by courtesy. Lady Beatrice herself, seated near the fire, orchestrated the conversation with the finesse of a conductor, her hands fluttering lightly over the delicate lace of her cuffs. "We must always admire restraint," she remarked softly, though her words were directed more broadly than to any single listener. A young lady who maintains her figure with such poise demonstrates a discipline that is quite enviable. One must only hope the regimen does not overpower the constitution. A faint ripple of knowing laughter passed through the group, polite yet edged with something darker recognition, fear, and admiration mingled in equal measure. The women present understood what Lady Beatrice would not say aloud, that the discipline involved powders, tonics, and cordials hidden behind silks and veils. They understood the precariousness of each admired figure, each carefully maintained composure. Eleanor adjusted her gloves, subtly pressing the fingertips against the tremor she felt despite the tonic's effects. Every whispered compliment, every soft murmur served as a reminder. To appear perfect was not merely desired, it was demanded. To falter, to show weakness, to reveal the toll of the tonics or the laudanum would be to invite censure, gossip, and perhaps social exile. As the hour waned, the salon continued its gentle murmur, the perfume and candlelight masking the undercurrent of observation. Eleanor understood with a bitter clarity that these whispers, these delicate assessments, were the true arbiter of society's favor. It was a world where beauty and fragility were applauded in equal measure, where the slightest tremor could be remarked upon, and where the women who appeared most graceful were often those most hollowed by secrecy and chemical aid. The salon's whispers carried on, soft as silk, as Eleanor sat still, poised, and trembling beneath her gloves, acutely aware that every word, every glance, and every muted judgment would follow her for the rest of the season. The morning air was cool, pressed with a fog that clung to the cobblestones and twisted through the arches of St. Margaret's Church like a grey tide. The mourners gathered in hushed clusters, their whispers soft against the chill, carrying faintly on the wind like secrets meant to die with them. Lady Eleanor Whitcomb's coffin, draped in pale silk and trimmed with modest lace, rested atop polished brass runners, its presence both fragile and absolute, a final testament to a life admired, envied, and hollowed by the exacting standards of Victorian society. The chapel was a study in quiet opulence. Candles flickered along the walls, their flames reflected in the polished oak pews, while the faint scent of incense mingled with lavender from the floral arrangements. A harp played softly, notes trembling in the dim light, weaving through the voices of the assembled ladies and gentlemen. Each face bore the carefully composed mask of grief, yet the glances exchanged told their own stories: admiration for the figure, fascination with her delicate composure, faint envy of the refinement she had maintained even in the moments before her passing. Lady Whitcomb's mother, draped in black, stood rigid at the front, her veil carefully arranged, her hands gloved and clasped as though controlling every pulse of emotion within her. She did not cry aloud, nor did she waver, but her eyes flickered toward the coffin with a weight that suggested both sorrow and relief. The years of careful maintenance, of whispered advice, of insistence upon refinement at any cost, had ended here. Yet even now, the praise for fragile elegance lingered, and she could not resist measuring her daughter against the ideal she had so meticulously cultivated. Among the mourners, friends whispered softly behind lace fans, "So delicate, so pale, so refined," they murmured, "such a loss." The words were as much appraisal as lamentation. The figure they mourned had been perfected in life by powders, tonics, laudanum, and careful restraint and elegance bought with trembling hands and hollowed ribs. Yet now, in death, she was lauded for that very frailty, a silent, macabre reward for the sacrifices made in life. Miss Catherine Langley, Eleanor's closest friend, stood at the edge of the gathering, her heart heavy. She had known, perhaps better than anyone, the true cost of the admired delicacy. She had seen trembling fingers, hollowed cheeks, nights of restless wakefulness, and mornings where tonic and cordial had replaced meals. She had tried, too late, to intervene. The social pressures, the expectations, the chemical aids, they had claimed Eleanor entirely. And now, the pale silk of the coffin draped over her fragile frame seemed almost to mock the quiet toll of months spent under unrelenting observation. The clergyman's voice rose softly, reading passages of consolation and scripture, yet the words seemed faint and distant to Catherine. She noted the precise fold of Eleanor's hands across her chest, the slight sheen of the veil that had once masked the hollow beneath her eyes. She remembered the days when Eleanor had walked with trembling steps but perfect composure through salons, balls, and drawing rooms, the nights when she had sipped tonic and laudanum in silence, the afternoons spent adjusting veils and gowns to hide fatigue, hunger, and fear. As the coffin was lowered into the earth, the muted murmur of the mourners swelled for a brief moment, then sank into solemn quiet. Catherine pressed her gloved hands to her chest, feeling the lingering ache of witnessing a life extinguished not by misfortune, but by the very perfection society had demanded. The pale silk, the delicate folds, the fragile veneer, they survived as a testament to admiration, not vitality. Victorian London mourned Eleanor Whitcomb as an emblem of grace, as a delicate figure admired and envied, unaware of the private sacrifices, the bottles hidden behind perfume, and the relentless fragility she had endured. In life, she had been perfected. In death, she was exalted. And yet, behind the veil of mourning, Catherine knew the truth. The cost had been absolute. The shop on Regent Street smelled of polished wood, camphor, and the faintest tinge of chemicals, as though the very air had been distilled and preserved over decades of service. Behind the counter, Mr. Theodore Hemsley arranged bottles with meticulous care, his hands steady despite the constant tremor of London life outside. His shop had long been the quiet arbiter of appearances, supplying the tonics, powders, and cordials that kept the city's finest women poised, elegant, and unbearably fragile. Today, a new batch of labels gleamed upon his shelves, freshly pressed and gilded in subtle metallic letters. Crested tonic for delicate nerves, elixir of refinement, cordially for gentlewoman's composure. The products themselves were unchanged, yet the labels were crafted with such care that they suggested novelty, safety, and sophistication, a gentle reassurance to the mothers, daughters, and heiresses who relied upon them. Mrs. Henrietta Blythe entered the shop, gloved and veiled, her posture as immaculate as the bottles before her. She moved with measured grace, each step calculated, her pulse quiet beneath the lift of tonic still coursing from her morning dose. Her eyes, luminous yet shadowed, scanned the shelves, noting the new labels with a mixture of admiration and relief. They suggested authority, discretion, and a veneer of respectability. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Blythe," Hemsley said smoothly, his voice carrying the warmth of familiarity. "You will find we have just received a new assortment specially labelled for the season." Henrietta inclined her head, letting her veil conceal the faintest tremor in her hands. "How fashionable," she murmured. Her gaze lingered on elixir of refinement, the letters gilded and intricate, almost luminescent in the morning sun. She knew what lay beneath the label: coca tonic, laudanum cordial, the carefully measured powders that had preserved her composure for months, yet hollowed her from within. Hemsley watched her quietly. He had observed generations of women like Henrietta, pale, delicate, admired, and entirely dependent upon his wares. He knew the toll they exacted, but he also knew the necessity. Victorian society demanded elegance above all, and the tonic, the cordial, the powders concealed behind glimmering glass and gilded labels enabled compliance with that exacting ideal. Henrietta reached for a small cobalt bottle behind the perfume, its blue glass faintly catching the lamplight. "I will take this," she said, voice low, "and another of the cordial for the evening." Hemsley nodded, retrieving the laudanum vial and placing it gently on the counter. "Of course, madam. Take care the dosage must be measured precisely, as before." She paid with quiet precision, counting the coins carefully, then tucked the vials safely beneath her gloves. The labels, gilded and bright, concealed the truth of their contents, yet the weight of the bottles was familiar and reassuring. They were both lifeline and secret, enabling her to perform the delicate ballet demanded by her social world. As she departed, the bell above the door tinkled softly, and the fog outside curled around the storefront, indifferent to the lives contained within. The new labels gleamed, promising refinement and propriety, while masking the same potent substances that had long kept London's finest women, slender, composed, and perpetually on the edge. Inside, Hemsley returned the remaining bottles to their places, his hands steady, his expression unreadable. The city outside moved with the usual urgency, oblivious to the quiet labor of concealment and preservation carried out behind the shop's glass windows. In Victorian London, appearances were everything, and a gilded label could preserve them, conceal tremors, hollowed cheeks, and nights spent in restless vigil. The tonic remained the same. The peril remained the same. Yet society would continue to praise refinement, unaware of the shadow beneath the gilded promise. The chemist's new label, bright and fashionable, ensured that the secret endured just as carefully as the women who relied upon it. The report lay on the polished mahogany desk like a quiet indictment, its crisp paper and neatly penned script belying the weight of its contents. Dr. Jonathan Everley, surgeon of some repute, had written it carefully, his hand steady despite the gravity of what he had observed. The letterhead read, "Everley and Sons, Consulting Surgeons," and beneath it, meticulous notes detailed observations that the world outside the office might have considered scandalous, yet, to Dr. Everley, were simply facts he could not ignore. Lady Arabella Sinclair had arrived at his consultation that morning with the usual air of elegance, her dress immaculately tailored, her posture flawless, her composure seemingly untouched by the physical decline that no one else was permitted to observe. Yet the surgeon, with the trained eye of years in practice, noted the hollows beneath her cheekbones, the faint bluish tinge beneath her eyes, the thinness of her wrists and neck. He recorded, clinically but compassionately, the tremor in her hands, the shallow rise of her chest, the faint but persistent pallor that betrayed months of suppressed appetite. He had also observed the effects of the remedies she took, the coca tonic, prescribed under the guise of nervous invigoration, and the laudanum cordial, intended as a soothing draught for delicate constitutions. In combination, they maintained her outward appearance of refinement while quietly eroding her vitality. Each entry in his report, though phrased with discretion, revealed the slow toll these substances exacted: heart rate irregularities, diminished muscle tone, faintness, tremors, and, most tragically, the hollowing of natural appetites necessary for the sustenance of life. Dr. Everley's pen paused above the final page as he reflected on the societal pressures that had driven Arabella to such reliance. Victorian society, with its rigid codes of feminine decorum, prized refinement, delicacy, and slenderness. Above all, elegance was currency, and appearances were meticulously policed. A young woman who failed to conform faced whispers, disdain, and marginalization. Those who succeeded, like Arabella, were celebrated, lauded, admired. But the celebration came at a hidden cost. Every ounce of praise masked a life constrained by chemicals, meticulous diets, corsets, and sleepless nights. He wrote with a sense of quiet urgency, knowing the report might never reach the eyes of someone who could intervene effectively. It would remain filed in his office, a record of fragility hidden beneath the veneer of perfection. He had been instructed to phrase each observation carefully, to avoid scandal, to preserve the reputations of his patients. Yet even as he composed the final lines, he could not disguise the truth. The young woman before him, admired for her elegance, was slowly eroded from within by the very substances celebrated as aids to refinement. The concluding paragraph read as gently as possible. The patient demonstrates significant physical fragility, which, if continued under current regimen of stimulants and sedatives, may result in further deterioration of health. Recommend careful monitoring, nutritional supplementation, and a gradual reduction of reliance on tonics, with oversight of a trusted guardian to ensure compliance and preservation of life. Dr. Everly leaned back in his chair, hands folded over his chest, the weight of the truth pressing upon him. Victorian society demanded appearances and rewarded them, yet the machinery that produced such perfection remained invisible, silent, and unacknowledged. The surgeon's report, precise and methodical, could not change that reality, though it might record it for history. The hollows behind the lace, the tremors behind the gloves, the cost of elegance that no one would ever truly see. He closed the notebook with a soft sigh. Outside, London continued in its fog, its gaslights, and its rigid social expectations, unaware of the toll exacted on those celebrated as fragile and refined. In his office, the report rested quietly, a witness to the private sacrifices demanded by a society that revered appearances above all else. The drawing room was quiet, still, and almost too perfect. Heavy velvet drapes framed the tall windows, and sunlight filtered through in muted beams that fell across the polished parquet floor. On the marble mantel, between gilded candelabras and a clock of delicate design, rested a photograph, a single image, sepia-toned and carefully preserved, of Lady Arabella Whitmore at 17, dressed in the light blue gown she had worn for her debut, her hair piled high with curls and adorned with a simple string of pearls. Her smile, bright and tentative, seemed almost innocent, yet it carried the first hints of self-consciousness that would shape her adolescence and the fragile adult she had become. The photograph had been taken years before the tonic, the powders, the cordials, before her life had been measured in appearances, in hushed approvals, in fragile endurance. At that time, she had been radiant, rosy-cheeked, full-lipped, unaware of the cruel arithmetic of refinement that would later define her very being. Yet the image now sat on the mantel like a relic, a silent witness to both what had been and what had been lost. Arabella herself entered the room, her gloved fingers brushing against the spines of books on the side table. Her reflection, in the polished surface of the fireplace, mirrored the changes the photograph could not capture. The delicate hollows beneath her eyes, the thinness of her arms, the slight tremor that betrayed her reliance on the tonic she had taken that morning. Her lips, though carefully rouged, were faintly pale. Her hands, though gloved, revealed the faintest hints of trembling whenever she moved, subtle as the quiver of a candle flame in a draught. She paused before the mantel, her gaze fixed on the photograph. For a moment, she allowed herself to remember the girl it depicted, bright, untouched, unshackled by the weight of expectation, unconsumed by powders or laudanum. The memory came with a pang, the life she had once lived, and the slow, merciless shaping of her existence into something admired by the world, yet hollow within. The mantel itself was a carefully arranged stage. Candelabras, clock, vase of fresh roses, symbols of refinement, of order, of the life carefully curated and presented. And in the center, the photograph was the quietest reminder, more honest than any compliment or approval, of the cost of that refinement. Arabella traced the edge of the frame with a gloved fingertip, the polish cool against her skin, and she imagined what she would say if the photograph could speak. It would tell of breakfasts she had left untouched, of the tonic and powders that sustained her day by day, of nights spent in restless, trembling vigil, and of the frailty that had been celebrated as elegance. A faint sigh escaped her lips. The tonic had steadied her hands, quieted the fluttering of her heart, and softened the sharp edges of her nerves, but it could not erase the memory of the self she had lost. The photograph, suspended between the candelabras and the clock, captured only what society wanted to see: the smile, the pose, the perfection. It could not capture the tremor beneath her composure, the ache of hunger, or the quiet surrender to powders and cordial that had become her daily ritual. Arabella straightened, adjusting the folds of her gown and smoothing the gloved fingers that had lingered on the frame. She left the room with the photograph still in place, its presence both comforting and haunting, a reminder of innocence lost, a testament to the life she had lived under expectation, and a silent witness to the fragile woman the world continued to admire. In Victorian London, the photograph endured, as precise and unyielding as memory itself. It preserved the image, the beauty, the grace, and hid the truth beneath the surface. And so it remained on the mantel, waiting for the eyes of those who would admire without understanding the toll it had exacted. The fog lay thick over London that morning, pressing against the windows of the Ashworth townhouse, curling around the chimneys and street lamps, and drifting in through the narrow spaces of doors left ajar. Inside, the house seemed suspended in a peculiar stillness, the silence carrying the weight of decades and secrets that had never been spoken aloud. In the drawing room, Lady Eleanor Whitcomb sat before the mirror, her hands folded neatly in her lap, the familiar tremor beneath her gloves restrained but unmistakable. The reflection that stared back at her was impeccable, pale, slender, composed, the very image of refinement admired by Victorian society. Yet she knew the truth of what she saw. The body beneath the gown was hollowed, worn by powders, tonic, and laudanum. The mind was frayed, sharpened and dulled in turns by the chemical rituals that maintained her outward poise. The bottles sat on the vanity, half hidden behind perfumes and powders, each one a quiet accomplice in her life of appearances. The cobalt vial of coca tonic gleamed faintly in the morning light, a reminder of the temporary lift it provided, of the false clarity it allowed her to summon, and the subtle cost it demanded. Beside it, a small laudanum cordial awaited the evening, a balm for trembling hands and restless nerves. These were not indulgences. They were necessities, instruments by which she navigated a world that demanded delicate perfection, and a world that applauded the very frailty it helped to cultivate. Eleanor's gaze drifted to the mantel above the fireplace. The photograph of her 17-year-old self, dressed in the pale gown of her debut, rested among candelabras and a gilded clock. The girl in the photograph smiled with innocence and vitality, unshadowed by the expectations, tonics, and powders that would come to define the adult she had become. It was a portrait of what had once been, and a stark contrast to the reflection she saw now, a reminder that beauty and admiration had been purchased at a price no one had acknowledged. Her thoughts wandered to the women she had known, friends and peers, who had endured the same quiet rituals. The tonic sipped in private, the powders measured with exacting care, the sleepless nights tolerated with a composure applauded by society. Each had appeared radiant, each had been admired for delicacy, yet beneath the silken lace, beneath the smiles and polite nods, the truth was identical, a hollowing of body, mind, and spirit, meticulously hidden and quietly endured. She rose from her chair, adjusting the folds of her gown. The mirror reflected the perfection society required, yet the truth lingered behind the reflection, the shiver of hands, the faint shadow beneath the eyes, the ache of a body restrained and hollowed to maintain its appearance. Eleanor walked to the window and drew back the curtain, letting a sliver of the fog-dimmed street enter the room. The city moved on below, oblivious to the sacrifices exacted from those it most admired. Eleanor exhaled softly and returned to the vanity, lifting the cobalt tonic once more. The rituals, the secrecy, the delicate performance, they were all part of the life that had allowed her to survive in a society that praised fragility while ignoring its cost. She tipped a small measure beneath her tongue, feeling the familiar warmth bloom in her chest and steady the trembling in her hands. In Victorian London, appearances endured, elegance was celebrated, fragility admired, and secrets, those quietly essential secrets, survived. Beneath lace, beneath corsets, beneath powdered faces, the women of the era had been preserved as delicate icons, their inner struggles hidden behind the beauty that society revered. And the secret, carried in vials, powders, and veils, survived the century. A silent testimony to the cost of refinement, to the fragility that was admired, and to the life that was quietly, invisibly spent beneath it all. Eleanor Whitcomb's reflection shimmered faintly in the glass. She touched the mirror lightly, acknowledging the truth it could not fully reveal, and stepped back. The city outside continued, unseeing, unknowing. The secret endured. It would endure long after the women themselves had faded from the world that celebrated their delicate shadows.